listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And coming to you live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more sides of the issues that matter. In the politically independent corner, I am radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are the show that brings you all sides of the issues that really matter. Again, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Back to work this week. We're here again on Monday, coming to you live with headlines. We're going to be talking about headlines in this segment, going into Jamarl's monologue. Then next segment, we're taking calls. Then at 7:30, we're joined by Caleb Maupin, with whom we're having a conversation about what's been going on in Portland, the whole secret police thing out in Portland, as well as Trump canceling Hong Kong's favored status. This happened over last weekend and this past week. Anywho, getting into the headlines. First up, 80-year-old Georgia representative and civil rights icon John Lewis has died as a result of cancer. Rep. Lewis was a prominent member of the civil rights movement at a very early age, acting as one of the Big Six activists influential in organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. At the time of his passing, Lewis had been a representative for Georgia's 6th District since 1987. And in our next story, for a brief COVID roundup, Florida has reported over 10,000 new cases for the 5th day in a row. This comes as ER rooms in many states seem to be running out of beds. People are getting pushed out into the hallways. I am seeing this reported all over the place in the news when I look around for it. In Texas, Nueces County, where Corpus Christi is located, 85 infants have contracted the coronavirus. And the Bahamas, obviously a prominent tourist destination for the United States, has banned flights from the U.S. and closed its beaches. This is after they saw their cases almost triple since the beginning of the month, since July 1st, from 104 confirmed coronavirus cases to 153. I'm just going to point that out. That is, I mean, again, they're very small comparatively. From 104 to 153, and we're seeing how many tens of thousands in Florida alone each new day, 50, 60-something thousand confirmed cases every day in the U.S. Anyway, moving on to our next story here. Union employees are planning protests across the U.S. today in support of Black Lives Matter, as well as higher minimum wages and expanded benefits. Organizers from unions, including the SEIU, that's the Service Employees International Union, say employees plan to walk off the job for 8 minutes and 46 seconds today. That is, again, as a tribute to George Floyd, who died after having his neck knelt on. That's a tongue twister. His neck knelt on for about 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Although this is a brief note. Apparently the prosecutors, I believe it was the prosecutors, originally put out that duration of time and then shortened it by about a minute. Again, this has become a bone of controversy for some, but that's just outside headlines. Getting into our next story here. In Portland, the police union president said he wants protests to stop and conversations to start. This follows a protest on Saturday night that was later declared a riot when protesters barricaded the police union building and lit it on fire. Less than an hour later, police had cleared the area and put out those fires. That city has been the center of the use of unmarked vans by camouflaged federal officials who have reportedly been detaining protesters without probable cause, a move that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has likened to the actions of a, quote, banana republic, end quote. Two House Democrats, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, have called for a probe into what they called, quote, secret police forces, end quote. And the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Marshals Service over their deployment of agents in the state. By the way, we're going to be talking about this a little bit later at about 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific with Caleb Maupin, who's joining us to talk about this as well as Hong Kong and China. In our next story, quarterbacks for the Saints and the Seahawks have been some of the most prominent players criticizing the NFL's attempts to deal with the coronavirus while starting its season. Issues for them include how regularly players will be tested, the number of preseason games, and the length of the acclimation period for avoiding injuries, as well as what protections there should be for players who want to opt out for safety concerns over the coronavirus. Again, we'll be talking about this at 7:30 with Caleb Mopin, but China is pushing back as the UK is set to suspend its extradition treaty today with Hong Kong. This follows a wave of events in recent weeks, arguably initiated months back by a wave of protests in Hong Kong that the United States funded and had backed. And then in recent weeks, Beijing had passed a controversial new surveillance law, basically suppressing dissent from pro-democracy or separatist protesters in Hong Kong. And that especially sort of added flame to the fire. The last couple of weeks have been, as far as I can tell, a constant barrage back and forth of various new sanctions and statements and just general moves. But again, we'll be talking about that at 7:30 in just 25 minutes with Caleb Mopin. And in my last story today, I'm going to be playing a clip at the end of this from Viktor Orban. The EU summit, which started on Friday, has been taking place over the weekend. And the Dutch prime minister, sort of leading this whole thing, says that it's been going okay. I think that he's equivocating a little bit because they're talking about a 750 billion euro. And he's been having problems, apparently. The deliberations have been contentious. Hungary's Viktor Orban has been the center of one of the main disputes, arguably the main dispute, with, again, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who made it a provision that countries taking grant money in the EU should be agree to be bound by the rule of law. Orban said the EU should instead pursue the rule of law procedure against Hungary that began in 2018 while focusing on solving problems with COVID-19 now. It seems like this has been made a part of this conversation, whereas apparently this whole rule of law thing that the EU has been trying to get Hungary to follow. And anyway, that's a sort of separate issue that came up in 2018, and it seems like they're trying to use this moment to push Hungary to make reforms, and Hungary doesn't like that. And anyway, we have a clip to play. This is actually Viktor Orban talking about Mark Rutte. Let's go with that clip, Andre.
I don't like blame game, but the Dutch man is the real responsible man for whole mess we have. I don't know what is the personal reason for the Dutch Prime Minister to hate me or Hungary, but he is attacking so harshly and making very clear that because Hungary, in his opinion, does not respect the rule of law, must be punished financially. That's his position, which is not acceptable because there is no decision about what is the rule of law situation in Hungary.
And again, that was Viktor Orban of Hungary. Just an interesting clip. I kind of like that clip for a few reasons, not the least of which is his accent and his use of the Dutchman, the phrase "the Dutchman," to refer to Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Anyway, we might play that again later. We'll be going into a break. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Oh man,
Dutchman is awesome.
Exactly. There we go. All right, those are the headlines. That's done now. Jamarl, what is your top priority for today? What are you going to talk about?
So, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do this monologue on today. I sat with my papers kind of scribbling melancholic, like at 4, 5 in the morning, without the power to necessarily get at why. Now, as a Sanders supporter, it feels somewhat shameful for me to admit this, but it is monstrously dispiriting to lose in pursuit of a worthy cause. Infinitely more so when you grasp in real terms what actually was lost. Now, liberals will laugh at my angst on this, and don't feel bad about that. I will do the same. We used to say it builds character. And yet, this is kind of where we are. 140,000 people dead. Like, that's monstrous when you try to put it in real terms. And we're seeing cases spiking all across the country. Now, this comes at a time with 30 million people out of a job, roughly 20 million people without health care in the middle of a pandemic. And at the exact same time, the President of the United States, without having any rationale as to how, is planning on throwing kids back into schools for ideological reasons. After all, if it's not safe for kids to go back to school, how can we make the argument that it's safe for people to go back to work, right? And on top of that, trying to block billions of dollars for states to conduct testing and contact tracing in the upcoming coronavirus bill. That's astonishing. Now this, to give you a taste of priorities, is in a country where the president can press a button and murder anybody around the world. Yet, we can't ensure that our healthcare professionals have the tools they need to do their job. A ham sandwich could have done a better job at this than Donald Trump in handling the twin crises of the protests and the disease. Madam Ham Sandwich, Portland is in flames. Should we send black hats to snatch people off the streets of America? Madam Ham Sandwich didn't respond, so I guess that's a no. I would even argue that Madam Ham Sandwich would be beating Joe Biden right now. I'd vote for her. But we don't have the indomitable ham sandwich. We have Trump. And to my chagrin, I'm stuck with the nagging pain of having to admit that Obama would not have lost 140,000 people. That hurts to say for some reason, but it is absolutely true. Basic things. Where is the president? He has the answer for this, right? It looks like you've broken the country. What is your excuse? Why are so many Americans dead? Hospitalizations, ICU visits, deaths, all going up. Arizona, Texas, calling for refrigerated trucks because the morgues can't keep up with the deaths. Florida, peaking in a number of cases. This doesn't look like embers, sir. Let's play the first clip. Chris Wallace, Donald Trump, embers.
Let's start with the surge of the coronavirus across the country in recent months. You still talk about it as, quote, burning embers. But I want to put up a chart that shows where we are with the illness over the last 4 months. As you can see, we hit a peak here in April, 36,000 cases.
Cases.
A day.
Yeah, cases.
Then it went down, and now since June, it has gone up, more than doubled. One day this week, 75,000 new cases, more than double.
Chris, that's because we have great testing, because we have the best testing in the world. If we didn't test, you wouldn't be able to show that chart. If we tested half as much, those numbers would be down.
But this isn't burning embers, sir. This is a forest fire.
But I don't say. I say flames. We'll put out the flames, and we'll put out, in some cases, just burning embers. We also have burning embers. We have embers, and we do have flames. Florida became more flame-like, but it's going to be under control. And, you know, it's not just this country. It's many countries. We don't talk about it in the news. They don't talk about Mexico and Brazil and still parts of Europe, which actually got hit sooner than us. So it's a little ahead of us in that sense.
But, sir, we have the 7th highest mortality rate in the world. Our mortality rate is higher than Brazil. It's higher than Russia, and the European Union has us on a travel ban.
Yeah, I think what we'll do, well, we have them on a travel ban too, Chris. I closed them off. If you remember, I was the one that did the European Union very early. But when you talk about mortality rates, I think it's the opposite. I think we have one of the lowest mortality rates in the world. We're going to take a look.
We had 900 deaths on a single day.
We will take a look
this week.
Oh, the indignity. Even safe space Fox News wasn't a safe space at the end of it all. Wallace was feisty in this interview. He had the gait of a younger man given authority by a stronger woman to come back with his shield or on it. And he took advantage of that to go after Donald Trump. To note, he fact-checked Donald Trump here and fact-checked him in a way that the president he basically stopped the show to fact-check Donald Trump. Even Fox News had a bottom. Is this the redemption of Chris Wallace? I have another clip to play here, but I don't know if I have time to play it. Let's try it. This was the checkmate of it all. There's multiple parts of it in this interview, but this is a checkmate. Let's play this clip. We'll play it up to a point, and I'll stop it if it goes too far.
Locking down again. Florida, deadliest day of the entire pandemic. Hospitals at capacity in a number of places around the country, shortages of testing, shortages of personal protective equipment for nurses and doctors. A lot of people say this is because we don't have a national plan. You talk about states. We don't have a national plan. Do you take responsibility for that?
Look, I take responsibility always for everything because it's ultimately my job too. I have to get everybody in line. Some governors have done well. Some governors have done poorly. They're supposed to have supplies. They didn't have. I supplied everybody. Now we have somewhat of a surge in certain areas, and other areas we're doing great. But we have a surge in certain areas. But you don't hear people complaining about ventilators. We've got all the ventilators we can use. We're supplying them to other countries. We go out into parking lots and everything. Everybody gets a test. We find if we did half the testing, with all of that being said, I'm glad we did it. This is the right way to do it. I'm glad we did what we're doing, but we have more tests by far than any country in the world.
But, sir, testing is up 37%.
Well, that's good.
I understand. Cases are up 194%. It isn't just that testing has gone up, it's that the virus has spread. The positivity rate has increased.
Right there, checkmate. We'll talk about it after, but checkmate. There's nothing that Donald Trump can say here to deal with that particular point. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back after the break.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with Shane Stranahan. You guys can give us a call at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. This is a call-in segment. Also, if you're listening in the DC area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can catch us at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Shane, that monologue ran a bit long, but my point that I'm trying to make is basically Donald Trump just got checkmated. And there's nothing that he can say in this case to explain that reality that Chris Wallace gave. And what makes it so bad, and I think the thing that bugs me more than anything else, is that Joe Biden is basically winning without having to do anything. I wanted Trump to be strong enough to be a foil in this race. Meaning I wanted to be able to put some level of support behind people who are saying, look, this is what I want from the standpoint of policy. And you're either going to win or lose based on whether or not you fall in line with these policies that the public is backed on or backing. Joe Biden didn't win on any policy. Joe Biden won entirely on this notion that he was more electable, something that is not in existence in real terms. But those people were terrified. And Joe Biden knows that like 70% of the public is basically voting for him because he's not Donald Trump, which means that when somebody says to him, hey, Joe Biden, how do you justify not supporting Medicare for all when 88% of Democrats support it and 70% of everyone else supports it? Not to mention we're in the middle of a pandemic with 20 million people out of work. 20 million people out of healthcare, 30 million people out of work. How do you justify that? And Joe Biden looks at me and says, go vote for somebody else. He can do that because he knows that people, like the greatest distillation of you have nowhere else to go ever created with Donald Trump, whereas Clinton was running against a phantom, Joe Biden is running against a disgrace. And that is the worst thing in the world because that means no priorities of people that people actually want to get done can get done through this dinosaur. And he knows it. He's winning, not for anything that he's doing, but entirely for who Donald Trump is and what Donald Trump is, how he's failed. And that is horrible to deal with and reconcile. What do you think about that?
I don't know what Joe Biden knows. The state of Joe Biden's mind, you said he knows it. I'm honestly not sure what he knows what's going on. Based on the way I phrased that, I'm not sure I do either. Earlier on, you were talking about the idea that the way that this interview went was a sort of checkmate for Trump. I think problematically,
No. Checkmate for Wallace. Checkmate for
Trump.
For Wallace.
Against Trump. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
The way the media works, the way that this optically this stuff goes, this is gonna be a brief moment. Like as far as I can tell, the vast majority of these other moments, mainly because it hasn't broken through the left-right barrier, the bubble, the news bubble. Most of the people who supported Trump aren't going to hear this, and if they do, they're going to disagree with Wallace. They're going to think that Trump's being treated unfairly, and most of the people who heard this and don't like Trump are just going to like him a little bit less after the end of this, like you did. You know what I mean? And to a certain extent, like I did. that's kind of one thing. On the broader point, you're absolutely right. The fact that on the one hand we're dealing with this dude, Trump, who seems to unsuccessfully have not navigated this crisis. He didn't get us out through the other side. We're still peaking. We're the world's epicenter, as far as I can tell. Like he said, we're pretty high up there in the mortality rate. So from any number of perspectives, just looking at this medically, mechanically, however you want to look at it, statistically, it's not going well for Trump or for us. And we're all the bearers of that bad news. On the other side of the political aisle, you have the dude who I started this off. He, as far as anybody who's looking at him and has looked at him for a while, he has serious cognitive decline. Like, that's not a joke. It's not good. It's not good for him, but it's especially not good for any of us if we have to deal with either of these two people as our political contenders. So what the hell are we going to do, man? I think this is off the show. We were talking at one point about the idea of jumping the shark, like different moments in recent political and national history when we've jumped the shark. I feel like this is kind of our electoral equivalent of jumping the shark. How much?
You think so?
I guess we'll see how much worse it could get, but this is not. It's not a good moment historically. Anyway, like you said, we're taking calls this segment 202-521-1320. I think we'll go to the caller real quick. Anything you want to say before we move on, though, before we go to Tarif?
No, I think that's what the melancholy is, right? I mean, because it's like there's no way out. There's no electoral path to dealing with any other crisis that deal with us, and yet people are going to jump to Joe Biden. Not, again, for anything that Joe Biden is doing, but entirely for who he's not. And Democrats are going to use Donald Trump as a henchman lurching through the sewers in order to scare children to vote for whatever random Democrat goes up. It is not a positive development in either case.
No, it's not good. I mean, let's just go to Tarif. I might have some more stuff to say later, but let's go to calls first. Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. Great to have you back. What is on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have 3 comments. I want to talk about Joe Biden might pick Kamala Harris because her half her ancestors, she's half Indian, and the reason why I was thinking about because India can have a cheap source of labor, and since the United States and China's not seeing eye to eye, the manufacturers probably bring the companies over there in India and do the same thing like they did with China. And they use Kamala Harris for that. A second comment is dealing with what's going on in Portland. I'm against rioting and looting. We need law and order for that. But what I'm also against, unchecked law enforcement, right? Where you have people jumping out of unmarked minivans and picking people off the street. What Nancy Pelosi and the other people in the Democratic Party and GOP is not saying, and the press is not saying, is skating around this subject, is that those dudes is protected by law. You know what that law is? The Patriot Act. That's what protects them. And probably the FISA Act, too. So you need to repeal that, and the media need to be honest, which I don't think is going to happen. My second comment is dealing with we need a better healthcare system. I was listening to Seth Guru this morning, and he's coming to that point. Well, we need a better healthcare system. You know, we shouldn't be charging people an arm and leg just to get a heart surgery, or $25,000 to $50,000 just to get heart surgery in the United States. And whereas in India, it used to be $4,000. Now it's $2,000 now, and it's cheaper elsewhere. But here, it's $3 to $4 trillion a year. It's profit in that. I mean, I believe in capitalism, but at the same time, I believe in regulation too. We need some type of common sense thing, maybe like a public option or a single payer program. Those with money, if you don't want Medicare for all, you don't have to get it. Just get your public option then. You know, we can have a fair system. That's all I want to say today.
Great comments. Thank you. Yeah. We're going to be talking about this stuff. We're going to be talking about the stuff going on in Portland with Caleb, and we talked about it briefly during the headlines there. But yeah, I'll take this just very briefly because I want to keep this kind of thing relatively short. I'll take it philosophical for a second. You look at violence and you look at the use of violence in societies, in some ways, civilization or societies or states, these different manifestations of human organization. It's like these are ways to solve the problem of violence. It's one of the problems they're trying to solve. You have violence. It's the sort of baseline way that people work things out when they're no longer getting along. You know, you deal with problems by communication, and then at a certain point, things break down, and there's just the sheer use of force. And then we built up all these apparatuses, specifically, you know, legal apparatuses, legal systems, to sort of restrain violence. And now from both ends of the political spectrum, from the public, the anonymous public, and from the government, you see, as far as I can tell, more and more of the unrestrained use of violence and force. And that's worrying. That's just on that deep level, looking at it from that sort of first principle perspective. That's the sign of a society that's at least temporarily gone into a serious state of decline. So that's that. We'll get back into that with Caleb, though. But what's your thought there, Jamarl?
I think you're right. I think you're right. But I think it's a society of decline. Yeah, I think we built up all sorts of structures in order to come up with ways of basically saying, look, let's have a game space where we agree on certain rules. And under those certain rules, we have those ideas of defining being right and wrong, etc. But let's be clear, those things aren't real. Like, everything is permitted in this game space. There's nothing that's going to stop something grotesque from taking place on this planet if it was going to take place. And the universe will bat not one eye for it. And I'm talking about in absolutes here. And in our own interpersonal things, we come up with these ideas and the ways of keeping ourselves intact. But the problem is that all societies are based on those rules. And if those rules start to get broken by the people who run society, at that point, the rules become null and void. It would have to be that way. Otherwise, you can have some extraordinarily dystopian societies where society gets into their head that, okay, we shouldn't push back because the rules tell us so. No, those laws are not ethical, moral, or anything else. They don't have to be. However, you would hope that there is some legitimacy to them that the people can agree upon where people are not necessarily overtly distressed. And I think that's where it boils down to it. It's not so much that I want rioting. I don't want rioting at all. Nobody wants rioting. I want an orderly society. But I recognize that orderly society has to come at the expense of a certain degree of social and economic justice. Otherwise, we're not being serious. If you have people brought up in difficult situations and you allow that to get entrenched in your society in a way where there's no political situation to deal with it. And I am telling you, I don't know if you remember this guy, Klobuchar. Klobuchar was like a multimillionaire or billionaire. Klobuchar went on MSNBC, felt perfectly comfortable to make the point of saying Nancy Pelosi needs to shut up about talking about that billionaire stuff because he will shut his wallets. Now, the point he was making to them is, at the end of the day, you guys, 90% of those races are decided by the side with the most cash. I am one of those people that is the deciding factor in whether or not you're going to get the most cash. And if you want to continue to get it, you're going to shut up. Meaning, an issue that actually may need to be dealt with and talked about in your society and democratically decided upon cannot be discussed because people with means are able to shut their political leaders up. Now, if you're dealing with a society like that and a public has no ability to deal with this in a political situation, what are they to do? And does it become like just infinitely reasonable to expect chaos? My answer is yes. It does. It's not that I like it. It's not that I love it. I don't like any of this stuff per se. And the standpoint of what I see as violence, whether it's perpetrated by the state or whether it's perpetrated by the public. By the same token, it's like, where does your society go with this stuff? And are there going to be expressions of violence that are not necessarily in line with what might be the best? Yes, unfortunately. It sucks. But it kind of is what it is.
We're seeing that. Yeah, we're seeing that stuff. We'll be getting back into this in just a minute. I think we should go to a break now so we can bring Caleb Muppin on early. Happy about this, excited about this. We'll be talking about this with him. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and an author. We'll be back with him in a minute to talk about, again, Trump deploying the secret police in Portland, these Portland protests, maybe this general issue of violence in politics in general, sort of foundational aspects of that issue. We're also talking about Hong Kong and China with Caleb. We'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined for this segment and the next by Caleb Maupin. He was a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and an author specifically of the book City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Articles and Essays on Socialism. You know what? Let's bring him in, and then I'll tell people where you can find him on Twitter and his website. But I believe that we have him with us. Caleb, are you with us this morning?
I am. How are you?
We're great, man. How are you doing? Or at least I am. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Watching events unfolding around the country and internationally, as always.
Glad to hear it. That seems to be something you do very well, based on the quality of your commentary. It's easier to do these days too, with all of us kind of sitting around at home, at least most of us. For people who are listening who want to know, you can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin, CalebMaupin. That's the same way it's spelled for his website too, calebmaupin.com. Again, that's CalebMaupin. In any event, those are where people can find you on Twitter and on your website. Glad to have you with us. We have 2 sort of topics set, one for the first segment, one for the second. I'm just laying it out for you so you know in advance. First segment, we're planning on talking about Trump deploying the secret police in Portland and this wider conversation. You might have heard the tail end of we're talking about this issue of violence, this foundational issue of violence. Brought up this point of violence at both ends of the spectrum, both from the protesters, a lot of them anonymous, and from, again, federal officials. First it was the police months ago. Now it's actually unmarked federal officials, camouflaged federal officials in unmarked vans. So you have violence from both ends of the political spectrum, kind of the corks coming undone. And my concern there is just that this issue of violence in political society, it's like when you don't have caps on that, when you don't have ways of dealing with conflict that keep them from escalating to this level where people's lives are endangered, which many of them increasingly are. It's a problem in our society. It's a big looming sort of foundational problem that I think it's easy for people to forget, but that we're being reminded of now. What's your take on that, Caleb? What's looking perspective? I know you're a socialist. You haven't gotten into too many conversations outside of that, but feel free to take it wherever you want.
Well, it's interesting. There seems to be a conflict at this point, a pretty big, solid conflict between the local government in Portland, Oregon, and the federal government, and that Donald Trump seems to believe that it's a crowd pleaser to his conservative base to look like he's bringing the hammer down on these protesters, and so he has dispatched these federal officials to go into Portland, and people have seen how they've been detaining people. They've been using tear gas that the local government and local police have been forbidden from using by the courts. And they're engaging in some rather severe measures. People have been shot in the head with impact munitions. People have been injured, and the idea is that on some level, Trump is hoping that his supporters will see him as being a strong man, stepping up and doing what the local government is afraid to do, doing the crackdown that local officials aren't willing to take. Meanwhile, many people around the country have spoken up and said this is repression. The kind of ongoing theme of many critics of Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is some sort of fascist, that his behavior is reminiscent of fascistic police states and stuff, is being played up. And so there's a lot more sympathy with the protesters on the streets of Oregon and a lot more outrage about the actions of the police than there would normally be. If it were local police that were going in and dealing with these protesters, there wouldn't be as much sympathy. But because there are federal officials on the ground, they're doing so in defiance of the local government. And because, they've been, grabbing people off the street, for example, and holding them for a few hours, and things to that effect, we have seen a widespread opposition to it. It's all very, very interesting because, it shows how complex American politics is becoming. Usually, conservatives are the ones defending the local government and arguing about federal overreach. But in this instance, we see the conservatives rallying behind federal officials, and it's the left and socialists and progressives that are supporting local officials. There's been some wild incidents recently. We saw this wall of moms that was created where they were trying to protect protesters from violence. That's one thing that's happened. There's just been many, many different things occurring here. But I think that underlying it all is the fact that a lot of people are unemployed because of this pandemic. They don't really, have a job to go to. A lot of people are broke and struggling because of this pandemic, and not just because of this pandemic, but because of the overall economic breakdown of U.S. society and the elimination of good-paying industrial jobs and rising low-wage police state. And so all that anger is boiling over in the streets of the United States, and there are different ways of understanding what's been going on with police brutality, different ways of understanding the problems facing U.S. society. The country is divided, and once again, we're seeing that play out on our streets.
I do find it interesting in Portland, especially with the moms. There was another one where apparently there was a naked woman who chased away a group of police officers who were terrified. Where do you think this goes? Now, is it fair to say that, and let me ask this in two ways. What authority is Donald Trump using to do this? Meaning, I understand that the president has all sorts of authority at his disposal. But is it legal to have agents who are basically suited up in black camo going around and plucking people off the streets into black vans?
Well, it's interesting because if you go back to 2012, when the NATO summit was convened in Chicago, there was quite a crackdown on protesters against that NATO summit, and there were raids of people's homes. There were some pretty intense activities on the street with people being clubbed and beaten bloody, and there was the fact that a number of, I believe, anarchist protesters were arrested and taken to this Homan Square black site that was being operated by the Chicago Police Department and held in conditions that some people likened to torture. And that often when you have, civil unrest going on in an area, it is not uncommon for federal agents as well as local police to begin engaging in activities that would normally be looked upon with horror, for example, like what went on in 2012. But let's recall that at that time, the United States public wasn't totally as divided as they are right now. The Obama administration, basically had the support of most liberals, and the Obama administration was strongly opposed by conservatives, and that the protesters in Chicago against the NATO summit were to the left of Obama, and they were seen as dissidents, and there wasn't much sympathy for them. So, while The Intercept covered what was happening and the crackdown and how the federal agents went in and did things and the cases that went on, and The Intercept covered it, and some, The Guardian and others, made noise about this activity being carried out by federal officers and such, and the repression that took place. The mainstream of U.S. media just kind of pretended it wasn't happening. It didn't get any much publicity. But what's interesting is now, because Donald Trump is such a polarizing figure, and there is such strong opposition to Donald Trump from so many figures within the establishment, that has kind of created an opening where what these federal officers are doing has become a front page story. It's weird. It was almost like people were waiting to get the go-ahead. That video of the federal officers, grabbing the young man and putting him in the unmarked van, that video surfaced, I believe it was midweek last week. I think it was like Wednesday or Thursday. It wasn't until Friday that the New York Times and the Washington Post, decided to run with this and really make it a thing. Then we saw tweets by Nancy Pelosi and others. And it seems like they were almost waiting for approval. Like there was even like some hesitation on the part of mainstream media. Like, do we do we cover this? Is it safe to cover this? We usually don't cover this when federal agents are going after protesters and dissidents. Do we cover this? Do we cover this? Oh, okay. It looks like we're going to cover this. All right. It's Trump. We don't like Trump. We're going to cover this. And I'm not using this to take the onus off Trump and say it's somehow okay. That's not my point at all. What I'm saying here is that divisions like this within the elite tend to create openings, in which issues that are not normally discussed become discussed. And that, the activities, the crackdowns, the repression against the Muslim American community that's happened since 9/11, some of the, increasing surveillance and harassment of political dissidents that's been going on and kind of escalated in the early years of the Obama administration. All of this has been a longstanding trend, but because of the Trump presidency and the divisions that the Trump administration has created, and the divisions within the elite of the United States, there's a conversation about a lot of things that have been kind of kept under the wraps for a few years. I think it's very, very interesting.
So it sounds like, just to briefly summarize, and then I kind of want to follow up on it. It sounds like you're saying because there's a conflict within the elite, because you have broadly, I'll split it into quote unquote the establishment media versus quote unquote Trump, because you have these two rival forces as elites combating over this issue. You have this opening for the Overton window, however you want to frame it, for this conversation to sort of shift into the actual problems that are going on, at least in this moment in time with some of these issues. Is that broadly what you were saying there, Caleb?
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think that these divisions at the top create openings for issues that have long been ignored by mainstream U.S. society to suddenly come to the forefront. And one of those issues is political and heavy-handed repression of protesters and dissidents by federal and local authorities.
So what would you do? This is sort of my follow-up. With this opening, looking at it from the mindset of somebody who can see these openings and thinks occasionally about how to try to handle them, how to use them, what would you do to get that message out there?
Well, I think let's talk about it. Now that mainstream media wants to talk about it, let's talk about things that have happened. Let's talk about how the FBI raided the homes of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in 2010. These are a group of, socialistic peace activists who've been operating in the United States, and all of their homes were raided, and all kinds of, property was taken from their homes, and they were called before a grand jury. Well, that happened in 2010, and this kind of thing goes on. Let's talk about what's happened to the Muslim community and how, provocateurs are sent into mosques. Federal agents walk into mosques and try to get somebody on tape saying something, so that then, we can get a headline that says the FBI stopped a terror attack, and all kinds of entrapment cases have been carried out against the Muslim community by federal officials in the United States. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what has been going on and the attempts to frame people, the attempts to create an atmosphere where people are afraid to peacefully organize for change and justice in the United States. Let's talk about it, because the media wants to talk about it right now. An opening has been created. We should talk about a lot of the cases that are going on, a lot of the situations where, we've seen so many black liberation activists, there's ongoing cases. Let's go over the history of COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, which was basically done to silence dissidents and activists in the 1960s and 70s. Let's talk about how, the Socialist Workers' Party sued the FBI during the 1980s, revealing all kinds of harassment to keep them from winning elections, to keep them off the ballot, to frame up their members on false criminal charges in instances. They revealed a campaign of harassment. This is a big issue, right? The United States pretends that it doesn't have a secret police. It doesn't have a political wing of authority. The police in the United States just enforce the law and allow the free democratic process to take place. Well, that's not the truth. That's simply not the truth, right? That there has been a deeply and highly politicized wing of the American police state apparatus that does target dissidents and activists and protesters. And that's a long-standing trend in U.S. society. And I think that we should take the opportunity to acknowledge that this exists.
Great answer. Yeah, a lot of stuff we talked about with this. Thank you so much, Caleb. We'll be back with you in just a minute. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to not only Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and myself, also the voice of Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. We'll be back with Caleb in just a minute to continue this conversation. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
You are listening to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We are joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of The City Builders and Vandals in Age articles and essays on socialism. Caleb, before we went on to break, you went into a really interesting place, and I kind of just want to stay there for a bit. Some people may be shocked and chagrined to hear that our great, strong-jawed men of the intelligence services and our FBIs and police and whatnot will actually go into protests in order to foment something that wasn't necessarily there, in order to destabilize those items, and that they've been doing this going all the way back to the 60s. Can you give a brief history on that? I mean, we've had COINTELPRO, we had Operation Mockingbird, where they were trying to influence the perspectives and opinions of the American public. We've even had programs that were outed. I can't think of the name of the author, Glenn Greenwald, The Intercept. They go over some of the publications dealing with it. But this goal to influence the perspective of the American public, especially with a bias towards taking out left-wing groups. Now, Antifa is not even a thing of a real thing, and yet all of this talk about Antifa, for example, Blue Lives Matter, or not the Blue Lives Matter, the Blue Lives leaks that the Intercept go into, and kind of make the point that for all of this talk of Antifa, a lot of this stuff ended up being right-wingers trying to create and foment something to make it look like the left was somehow trying to have some uprising. This has been stuff that has been somewhat seeded in our culture that we don't necessarily talk about. And as you say, they want to have the conversation, so let's have the conversation. This has gone back to the 60s, correct?
Sure. Well, for decades, the FBI had a program called COINTELPRO, and that was short for Counterintelligence Program. Now, when you think of counterintelligence, you think of like spy versus spy, you know? But the program was targeting left-wing activists in the United States, peace activists, black liberation activists. Yes, it targeted the Communist Party of the United States. It targeted Students for a Democratic Society. It targeted the early gay rights movement and such. But why was it called COINTELPRO, right? I mean, you'd think it would be called, counter-protester operations or counter-dissidents or something. Well, it was based on this feeling during the Cold War that left-wing activism and left-wing sentiments in the United States was not legitimate. It was all part of a Russian conspiracy, right? That these people that marched against the Vietnam War, well, this was intelligence. This is somehow a Russian plot. This is, a Soviet plot. These black activists who wanted to end Jim Crow segregation and police brutality and poverty and such. Well, that's clearly got to be an intelligence operation. So the FBI set up its counterintelligence program to combat dissidents based on this narrative that dissent in the United States is all a foreign conspiracy. Now, doesn't that sound a little bit familiar? But furthermore, right? I mean, this FBI program, COINTELPRO, you read about its history of, infiltration of left-wing groups, media campaigns to isolate left-wing groups. It's a long-standing trend. And now, as we see the situation playing out on the streets of Portland, we see federal officials on the ground doing things that local police have made a decision not to do, and really kind of escalating the situation there. Things have gotten a lot more intense there very, very quickly. You have to wonder what the goal is. I mean, are federal officials really trying to bring peace to the streets of Portland by engaging in these provocative activities, or is the goal to win some publicity points for Donald Trump, to to frighten people, perhaps to create outrage, to change the political conversation and shift things away from the ongoing problems as a result of the pandemic and make it about left-wing protesters who cause problems and break things or something. What is the goal of federal officials here? Because if their goal is to stabilize the situation and make everything peaceful and make everyone calm down and everything go back to normal, they seem to have quite the opposite effect.
Yeah. Were protests going down before the federal agents invaded Portland?
Yes.
Yes. Protests have been going on for months. I mean, this is a response to the killing of George Floyd. There's ongoing issues, police brutality, and there's issues, economic, outrage as well. And that, yes, Portland, just like every other city, has had ongoing protests. But now, suddenly Portland has become the center of attention. There was a lot of talk about Seattle and the Chaz, and the Chaz, and I think that now Portland has become our focus, and there's a differing approach to these protesters. I think that the Democrats are willing to have a conversation with them, and they see the protesters as having legit concerns, and the Republicans view these protesters as dissidents and criminals who need to be crushed. Now, what's very strange is the narrative that a lot of the Republicans have about this pandemic, especially when it comes to the wearing of masks and stuff, is a very anti-federal government narrative, right? You've heard Republicans say things like, well, wearing a mask is so the government can tell who's going to submit, and that, the pandemic is some kind of government experiment to see who will submit to authority. And so they have this libertarian narrative, but yet they're cheering for federal officers being deployed on the streets of Portland to treat dissidents rather harshly. It doesn't quite add up. There's this Alex Jones vibe you get from a lot of Trump supporters, that the government is out of control, it's taking away our rights, and, those the whole QAnon thing, and they think Trump is their man on the inside fighting the deep state. But yet they seem very, very supportive of some pretty harsh tactics being used by federal officials against dissidents and police state, behavior on the streets of an American city. It doesn't exactly add up, and there seems to be a kind of dual mindset where it's like Trump supporters, they almost have two views of the federal government and two views of authority. They're libertarians someday and authoritarians another.
I can see that. Yeah, and just to be clear here, there's been over 50 days pretty much straight in Portland of active protests. I think it was the 52nd day of this consecutive series of protests every day going on in Portland. Seattle's still active. Portland has definitely become the center of attention in recent weeks, and especially in the last week when reports of these unmarked cars came out. But yet, also Denver. We haven't been talking about Denver much. There were Aurora, Colorado protests going on, and in Denver proper, that's been ongoing. A few ways I could go here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go somewhere a little bit weird with this. I want to go briefly back to the 30s. We were talking about COINTELPRO, talking about the founding of a lot of these programs. You're a socialist. I'm neither a capitalist nor anything else that anybody else can understand with the simple label. I'm a weirdo. So we're kind of coming at it from uneven ground here, but I'm not going to try to put it on those terms on this ideological level. I'm just curious, going back to the 30s and 40s, it seems like there was this massive rise of these new ideological movements. You had fascism, you had the instantiation of Marx a couple decades earlier in the Soviet Union, obviously 1917 through 1919 at that period. But then in the 30s, you saw the rise of a few different forms of fascism, and the sort of ideological conflict, which had been brewing over the recent decades, came into sudden clarity, it seemed, obviously with World War II. And then it seems like you had this long, drawn-out Cold War between the States and the Soviets. During this period, though, there is this transfer of intelligence from the English to the Americans. It seems like this set into stone a lot of the perspectives that we have now. One of the aspects of this that I wanted to try to bring to the conversation for a second was this idea that maybe each ideology, each major state was sort of imitating the worst excesses of its neighboring states and of its competitors in terms of being permissive of, for instance, secret surveillance in the United States, surveillance through COINTELPRO, this isn't surveillance exactly, it's more media manipulation through Mockingbird, another fairly well-known CIA program. My point being, it seems like we may have justified this, and other countries and other ideologies or other enactors of ideologies may have justified their own sort of worst excesses by looking at what the competitors were doing. Is that a process that you've seen playing out over the last century, and do you see any of that going on these days, where we're looking at what the other side is doing at its worst, and then we're sort of justifying our own behavior based on their worst excesses?
Well, I think one way that you can look at that is that, the Soviet government made no bones about what it was. It was a Marxist-Leninist government. They believed in communism. The government was trying to push a communist agenda. Their police forces, their military were all ideologically believing in communism. They felt it was their duty to suppress opponents of communism. They were pretty straight up about what they were doing. Right. And you can say the same for fascist governments. I mean, they had, police forces and militaries that believed in fascism. They had, governments that were completely controlled by fascist parties. The government made no pretense of being open and free and liberal. They were pushing a fascist agenda. But what makes the United States particularly weird is throughout the Cold War and even up until today, we maintain that our system is just open democracy, right? Our federal officials don't have any political agenda. They just enforce the law. Our foreign policy isn't ideological. It's just about keeping the world safe and allowing, the open international system to continue and protecting human rights, et cetera. We're not supposed to have any of the stuff that fascistic or communist regimes had. We're just supposed to be liberal, right? Liberalism, the idea of open society, open ideas. I mean, we're just supposed to be, government hands-off, protecting human rights. But underneath that, in order to protect this quote-unquote liberal system, there is a very, very, very ideological core that says we need to suppress communists, we need to suppress dissidents, we need to maintain control over media narratives with elements like Project Mockingbird and make sure that media outlets are pushing, a narrative that is, in line with U.S. foreign policy. Behind the liberalism of U.S. society, there is this deeply, deeply ideological message and ideological orientation that exists. And, for example, during the recent Democratic primary on MSNBC, we saw Chris Matthews have this bizarre meltdown in response to Bernie Sanders. I don't know if folks recall this, but he says, he's going off on Bernie Sanders and after one of the debates, and he says, if Bernie Sanders had won, there might have been executions in Central Park in New York City, and some people would have been cheering for my execution, and I would have been executed. And what in the world is this man talking about? What is he talking about? What is he talking about? Well, it's pretty clear this guy has an ideological orientation. As somebody who's supposed to be a TV host and just give their commentary, there are people in the government, there are people in the mainstream media, there are powerful interests, and he has a very ideological orientation, and he sees Bernie Sanders as being, quote, on the wrong side of the Cold War, right? That underneath the liberalism of U.S. society, there is ideology, there are political motivations, and that liberalism, in a lot of ways, is just kind of a cover. It's kind of a mask that ideologically, covers the fact that the United States does have all these things we condemn governments around the world for having.
Caleb, in our last 30 seconds to a minute here, I want to close it out with a quick question. Do you see that inconsistency or that contradiction or that misapplication, however way you want to look at it, and it'll hinge on your answer? Do you see that as essential to liberalism, or do you see that merely as the sort of result of the bad incarnation of liberalism through the United States in the 20th century?
I think that as long as society is divided into classes and some people have the wealth and the power and the resources, that the state is going to be, bent to ideologically work in those people's interests, and that pretending that it is just standing above all society and naked and has no agenda and serves all people equally is a bit of an illusion.
Great answer. That's exactly as pivotal as I hoped it would be. Thank you for that, Caleb. Thank you for joining us. And that was the voice of Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Specifically, he's the author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. For everybody who's been listening, you can also follow Caleb on Twitter and on his website. On Twitter, he's Caleb Maupin. Nothing funny there, just his first last name, at Caleb Maupin, and his website is calebmaupin.com. We have another 2 great hours coming up. Margaret Kimberly at 8:30, then Tom Luongo at 9:30. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am Shane Stranahan, radio show host.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, 80-year-old Georgia representative and civil rights icon John Lewis has died as a result of cancer. Representative Lewis was thrust into the civil rights movement at an early age and was willing to offer his body as part of the cost to dissipate the grotesque deficit in social justice that existed in the 60s. In Texas, Nunes County, where Corpus Christi is located, 85 infants in one county has contracted COVID-19. After a temporary flattening of the trend, the number of new cases have skyrocketed as the state governments across the country continue to pursue a policy of opening the economy. Controversy has arisen over a proposed housing and urban development rule that will permit federally funded homeless shelters to pursue to use a person's physical characteristics, such as height or facial hair, to determine whether they belong in a women's or men's shelter. This is according to a copy of the rule obtained by Vox. In the latest Washington Post ABC poll, Joe Biden extends his lead over Trump with 55 to 40% of registered voters choosing Joe Biden. In May, Biden was ahead by 10. In March, Biden was ahead by only 2. Trump has seen a 28-point drop in the public approval of his handling of COVID-19 since March, with weakening even showing up in his public appraisal of his handling of the economy. For reference, at the same time in 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading 47 to 43. COVID roundup. Florida has reported over 10,000 new cases for the 5th day in a row. In Texas, Noon says, where Corpus Christi, I think we did that one, fair enough. Union employees are planning protests across the United States in support of Black Lives Matter, as well as a higher minimum wage and expanded benefits. Organizers from unions across the SEIU and Service Employee International Union, the Service Employees International Union, says employees plan to walk out of the job for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This is in course of memory of George Floyd. In Portland, the police union president said he wants the protests to stop and a conversation to start. This follows a protest Saturday night that was later declared a riot when protesters barricaded the police union building and lit it on fire. Less than an hour later, police cleared the area and put out the fires. The city has been center of for the use of unmarked vans by camouflage federal officers who have reported using and detaining protesters without probable cause, a move that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has likened to actions of a banana republic. Interesting term. Two House Democrats, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, have called for a probe into what they call a secret police force, and the ACLU has filed lawsuits against the DHS and United States Marshal Service over the deployment of the agents in the state. Quarterbacks for the Saints and Seahawks have been in some of the most prominent players criticizing the NFL's attempt to deal with the coronavirus while starting the season. Issues include how regular players will be tested, the number of preseason games, the length of the acclimation period for the avoiding injuries, as well as the protections that will be in place for players who want to opt out. The Dutch Prime Minister says the EU summit will talk over 750 billion that are making progress but still could fail. The deliberations have been contemptuous, with Hungary's Viktor Orban, the center of one of the main disputes. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte made it a provision that the countries that are taking grant money from the EU should agree to be bound by the rule of law. Orban said that the European Union should instead pursue the rule of law procedure against Hungary that began in 2018 while focusing on solving problems with COVID-19. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. So a few of these are interesting to me. One of the ones, I'm really glad we had Caleb Malton. Caleb is awesome for the protests in Portland. He's really, really knowledgeable of that stuff going back a long time and coming up into our current time period. I think one of the interesting ones to me, believe it or not, is in part, let's do the Washington Post poll first. That poll is rough. If your name is Donald Trump, that poll is rough. Now, if you look back at Clinton versus Trump, Clinton was leading 47-43. That's a 4-point spread. Joe Biden is leading by 15-point spread. Now, even if you take for the moment and say, all right, well, yeah, but Clinton lost pretty badly. Fair enough. Was it by a 15-point spread? Let's see the spread is only 10 points. That's Joe Biden still winning by 5. That's a landslide. Like, he has, I don't know if he has to be aware of this. There's no way they're existing in a bubble of reality that is that pure and untouched where reality just can't, get in, where they can just talk about these things in this kind of mythical, fanciful world as if he is somehow doing good. He is failing miserably. And Joe Biden is basically staying in his basement. This is going to be the first presidency in my lifetime where the candidate doesn't really have to do anything to win, just to not be the other guy. So sad.
You'd think Joe Biden would have had a couple decades to move out of the basement. You'd think successful politician, years of experience, he would no longer be just living in the basement. No, I mean, here's the thing. Trump is probably waiting on a couple months to pass, Biden to come out, and then people to see how not well he's doing, which I think a lot of people just haven't been seeing as much. You know what I mean? Because he hasn't been in the public eye quite as much. I mean, that's another way of looking at this. The mind does try to draw parallels with the last election because, of course, all the polling was getting it wrong leading up to the actual day when the results were announced. So a lot of the sort of, again, you're framing it in terms of the 2016 election, and that is valid because that's obviously the last precedent here. But going into it, this is, as far as I can tell, this is unprecedented. Again, he's going to be going up against anybody who's watching him speak for more than about a minute or two, especially on unguided on a topic of nobody's choosing or however the conversation goes. That's not going to be the case if it's debate. Everything is going to be corralled. But still, even then, if there were some sort of public airing of competence where they were both together on a stage or at least in their own basements talking online, you'd think that there would be, and we might see yet, some major sea change in public opinion on this stuff as people start to realize how badly Biden seems to be doing. At least that's my take.
That's the part, Shane. That's the part. Now, if they get to the debates and Joe Biden gets eaten alive, maybe some changes. If Joe Biden just coasts. I mean, honestly, if I am Joe Biden's person, I am probably telling him, dance. Dance, Joe. Dance. Just dance, river dance. Like, don't get close. Don't let him lay a glove on you. Don't get into a fight don't do any of that stuff. Just dance. Whatever policy you put out, fair enough. You could say you support it, but you could say those dastardly Republicans stop you from doing it. Just dance. And just dance all the way to the election. Because if you get into a fight with Trump and lose, oh, that hurts, that may bite. And you don't know what happens in the next several months. Oh, we've had so many sea turns in what has been taking place in this year that it's hard to kind of look and say, We know exactly from a God's level that this is, I can't say that. We have no idea what's going to happen in the debates. Joe Biden may blow a fuse in those debates. Anything can happen. So I can't say perfectly, but I would say this. If Joe Biden can just coast, he wins. That's the catch. That means that the onus is on Trump to do something in those debates and to make it that much more clear why he's the person who should be in charge. And he's going to have to do it almost entirely from the debates because everything else that's around him at this moment is bad for him. Like the talk, like the conversations we're having right now about COVID-19. That's horrible for him because he fails on that so poorly. The race conversation, he fails on that so poorly. Like even the protest stuff, he fails on that stuff so poorly. And so the one beaming light that he had was the economy. And he lost 8 points even on that. And that's just this poll. There are other polls where he's lost even that. So, I mean, like, what do you tell him? If you're whispering in his ear, Shane, what do you tell him?
Trump?
Yeah. What do you tell Trump? I mean, because Joe Biden, I'm telling you, Joe Biden's people are telling him, Joe, just dance. Don't get close. But what are you telling Trump if you're the person whispering in Trump's ear?
I would tell him to do a bunch of outrageous things because I'm a troll and I would just like having fun with a short period of time. I would tell him, get up, walk outside. You're only wearing your underwear and have a real conversation with people, sort of cross-legged, Native American style, on the ground in front of the White House. Because I just think that would be entertaining and it would spark a generational renewal in the American body politic. But that's my little trolling personality. I have no real guidance for Trump.
Generation of renewal. Generation of renewal.
That is the
I believe it or not, I would have guidance for Trump. I mean, the stuff that I would tell him to do, he would never do. But I would be like, look, you need to go out and you need to basically federalize the economy. Not major companies, just small businesses. And you need to make sure each and every person is made whole up to like 80% of their salaries. And on top of that, you need to ensure that all of these people have health care. And I guarantee you will win the next election. Because he would come across as presidential and he would be dealing with the thing that those people cared about most, the coronavirus. Now, the problem with that is 140,000 people are already dead. And, it's kind of like if it's like climate change, or it's like the light from the sun. It takes 8 minutes or so to get here. Somebody can destroy the sun right now, and we would not find out for 8 minutes. Well, it's the same thing with climate change, right? Where you have a certain amount of energy packed into it. Meaning, if you stop all fossil fuels, you still have 10 years of heat that you got to deal with. Same thing with this. Meaning, even if Donald Trump turns around and does everything right in this very moment, you would still have X number of lives that are going to be lost because of his incompetence. So even that, I don't know if that works, but it would help a lot of people going forward.
Well, if something happened on it, if the programs worked well, that'd definitely help. The problem is that if you're giving guidance to the president, whether it's Trump or another president, it's like you're having to deal with at least two different entities. One is the person themselves, who seems to get smaller and smaller as they get older in that job because their sort of degrees of freedom, their abilities to make their own choices, just diminished over time. And then the other thing is you're dealing, the other agent you're dealing with is this sort of black box entity of incentives and pressures that isn't thinking just in terms of what you're saying, whether it's right or wrong, but how well they can get it done, what it would cost them in terms of their constituencies or their backdoor alliances, all this stuff. So it's like you have that two-level conversation. And with Trump, it's the hope that people had, and this is where we can sort of tie this model into the actual conversation about politics in 2016 and 2020. The hope that people had was that he was going to be the first, that he was going to be a real person who was sort of on his own agenda, doing his own things. And then yet it seems what happens. He gets put in, he relies on advisors, even though he's not tied too deeply into the political establishment. Pretty quickly, he gets captured by it just because that's what you need to do to actually make things happen in the presidency. You see what I'm saying there, though? It's like this bifurcated, bi-level conversation that we're sort of pretending we're having. We're talking about Trump as if he's a person, whereas the degree of Trump's freedom as a person seems to have gone down over time. You're talking about pushing a healthcare package. Yeah. Put aside for a second the 130-something thousand people who've died trying to get over that, trying to move over that like it's water under a bridge. Of course, it can't be. It's bodies. But even if you get over that for a second, he can't make healthcare happen because he's allied with people who don't want that to happen. And I'm kind of I've expressed reservations about Medicare before. That's why nothing's getting done. Is everybody's tied into these long-term, decades-old political alliances that have very little to do with either what the public in its best moment wants, or with what's possible. I mean, again, if we're stuck in this, and this is I don't mean to harp too much on Medicare. It's just sort of what triggered this. But if we're having this conversation, why don't we focus on like science and technology? Why don't we focus on, again, I brought this idea up of healthcare too cheap to meter. Why don't we focus on making healthcare incredibly cheap, incredibly widely distributed? Why don't we do it with science and technology? Why don't we do it in a way where it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's safer, it's more practical? Everybody has it. It doesn't cost us practically anything because we developed the tools to help us with it. You see what I'm saying? That's a whole other level of conversation that's admittedly idealistic, but might serve at least as a sort of North Star for where we should be going in that one institutional domain. That's what I want, man. What's your take?
Let's talk about it on the way back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. I want to get back to this conversation. I love this. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. If you guys are listening to us in DC, we're coming from DC, but if you guys are in DC, you can hear us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. This is a call-in segment, so if you want to give us a call, you can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We were having a conversation on Medicare for All, and I've heard Shane's skepticism on Medicare for All before, so that's fair. And make the argument of making healthcare too cheap to meter. I am there with you. I, in my head, believe that for the most part, things that are vital services should be functioned as such, meaning there should not be capitalistic pause on those things that we depend upon as a society, and we should make excess. And making excess in a way that those things are so cheap that those things are basically practically free. Now, I would love that. I would love to have technology marshal to those aims. And the same thing whether it be with healthcare, and if I'm being honest, with pretty much anything else, I would be perfectly okay with that. Catch. The ideologies that are prevailing today would not allow that. If you could have power flying through the sky, somebody would say, how do you meter it? Because at the end of the day, somebody's going to want to make a buck out of that process. Healthcare is no different. And the health insurance companies and everything else, those guys are a business. The people who are pushing Medicare for All, it's fair to say that those people have a certain idea of how they want that stuff to work. Fair enough. And you can even argue that that's a maximalist position. I don't think that's a maximalist position, but fair enough. But the catch is, when you're looking at prevailing ideas and you ask the public just what do you want? And they've tried Obamacare, they've seen Trump care and recoiled in horror, and you have this other guy who's saying, hey, what about us? What about this? And the public says, fair enough, we'll take it. That's different than having just an ideology fighting over one another where the public is basically not getting a choice, so the public is basically ignored. This is something different. Now, if you told the public, too cheap to meter, the public would say, great. But I'm telling you, somebody would say, how do you put a meter on it? Which is the problem. It's not so much that the idea is wrong. It's not so much that it's even too idealistic. I think the problem is that you have to fight the ideology first to even get to the point of having this thing. Because think for the moment, all of the products like Amazon. Amazon is an amazing thing in regards to the organization that can get products all over the world, all over the place that it needs to. It would even probably have flying drones at a certain point, dropping off packages. Amazon is owned by a small body of people, despite the fact that you have workers all over the United States who are working at those stores, buying those products, who had to get education and public services. I mean, from the standpoint of our schools, who have fire departments and police departments. All of those things take place, and yet that money is just accrued to the top. The technology is used for the interests of the 1%. That's just true. And it's like until we reconcile that any device that's going to be built is going to be built in the service of profit. And that belies this notion of too cheap to meter. It can never be too cheap to meter if the entire point of the device is profit. Would you agree with me on that, or you disagree with me on that?
No, so I don't disagree with you. There's a bunch of stuff that I could, but it's just a conversation. You kind of eat away at the parts of it that feel a little bit unsturdy. You set up those supports conversationally, and then you kind of keep going as you excavate it together. So we can do that.
Perfect. I totally agree.
Two responses here. One, we're talking about ideologies. I'm going to come at this from a weird angle. It could be cynical or optimistic, depending on which side of it you're looking at it from. I don't think that we exist in any ideologies right now. There's only one coherent ideology maybe that seems extant in terms of a state upholding it, and that's arguably China, where China has socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's pretty well laid out. I disagree with most of it, at least the distinct parts of it. There's a lot of stuff I disagree with there, but I will give them props. They have a fairly well-defined, decades-old ideology with centuries of history, et cetera. The United States is all over the place. Russia's all over the place in terms of the main international competitors. There's not a clear ideological hotbed anywhere that's producing a sort of unified front for the state to operate on. And arguably that's good because ideology as a whole might be a little bit outdated. But here's my point. Here's where it comes back to it. There's a space here, not in the realm of ideologies necessarily, but in the realm of ideas about politically, economically, socially. How are we going to get through this century alive, if not better than we came into it? And the second part, the sad part, is that the second part to a lot of people sounds fabulous, like ridiculous, like completely unreal. Not just that we're going to get through the end of the century alive, but somehow we might actually do a little bit better than we were in 2000, 2001, let alone 2020. Again, the fact that seems impossible, I'm guessing that it seems impossible to a lot of people. That's very sad to me, but it also does come back to the core. There's this space with the failure of these grand ideological systems, and yet we have still this global economic and political arena that all of these states that grew up in ideologies sort of are conversing in terms of. They're speaking with these ideological ideas. Our mass political conversations are happening in the United States in this sort of long drawn out competition between capitalism, quote unquote, and socialism, quote unquote, and sometimes fascism gets thrown in there as a sort of boogeyman to scare each side into acting more like some arbitrary center or something like that. Like we're in this space where we can do so much more. And I think that a lot of the push that people are feeling and a lot of the consternation and confrontations that people are having as they deal with each other is that we don't have any actual clear new conversations to have about these things. As far as I can tell, a lot of the conversations that we're having are almost a century old. They were had first in about the 1930s, about the 1940s. This stuff is all so old. That's the sort of grand point. Coming back to the center, yes, you're absolutely right. We exist in a system where from top to bottom, institution by institution, sector by sector, you look at these different industries. They're dominated by these older ways of organizing things. A lot of people will call some of those aspects capitalistic. Some people who don't like socialism will call them socialistic, depending on what you're looking at. We're totally in that space. We're totally in that conversation. And you're right. If you invent something that's too cheap to meter, sure enough, somebody's going to try to find a way to meter it, try to make an extra cent or two on every unit of efficiency they output or whatever the case may be. That definitely happens, but it's also on our end, in some sense, as people, as individuals, and as members of societies, to try to work on that stuff too. To criticize it, to push it forward. Anyway, this is all super abstract, sort of, but I think you might see where I'm going. Yeah.
I I hear you. Well, no need to apologize at all. No, I hear you. So one thing here is that I think a lot of people can agree that there are a lot of things to criticize, and most of the people who are criticizing these things will sort of also have overlapping criticisms. We can agree on what we don't like. It's a lot harder to agree on what we do like, and I think that's where ideology takes us wrong. I think we're sort of falling back on these old definitions of things and old definitions of problems, et cetera. Like that's where the new thought, I think, comes in. It's not finding more to criticize. Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's a broad take. Go for it. No, please go. You were going somewhere, and I didn't want to cut you off. We only have 2 minutes. Go for yours, and then I'll go with mine. Okay. So here's kind of where I'm leaning right now. Here's kind of my MO with this stuff right at this second. It doesn't make as much sense to have a revolution on the high level. What does make more sense to me is to have more experimentation on the lower levels. Here's where I see it. I'm looking at this from this perspective of the United States. I see the federal government with a huge number of problems. You see municipalities in the lowest levels. You see states having problems with the federal government as a whole, as a sort of behemoth capstone thing that holds the rest of it together, is having a lot of problems. Problems with debt. Obviously, modern monetary has its own contributions to that conversation. But as far as I can tell, debt is a longstanding problem in the United States. Where if other countries try to call in their debt, it's just this. It's this messy process. Anyway, I see a very real threat / possibility of the federal government being unable to fulfill a lot of its central functions in any efficient way at all over the next, say, couple of decades. Once that happens, it might be feasible for the federal government to devolve a lot of the responsibilities to localities, to either states, which is the sort of traditional federalist route, or subdivided through states into local communities. At the same time, there's this opportunity for people to, instead of falling back on old ideologies, to experiment with new and local variations of ideas about how to apply different spheres of thought, whether it's economics, whether it's social, whether it's political organization, whether it's creating and maintaining effective institutions. There are all these sort of different spheres of activity that we might do a lot better on this local level, on this smaller level, again, whether it's a city or a state or a county. And if we use those as sort of hotbeds for experimentation, that might help to give us a lot of the answers we're looking for in terms of how we can organize society effectively on these higher levels. And there's a sort of, again, you're talking about how can you make this change? I don't see it as one big change. I see it as a sort of process of incrementally, as much as we can, trying to do these experiments locally, and then we'll learn lessons that we can apply on that higher level. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
I agree with that. No, I do agree with that. I don't have any disagreement with the experimentations and everything else. I think, though, just to slightly push that I think you underestimate how much force will be applied to crushing anything that you try to do like that. But I agree with all of it. But you're listening to Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live from our station outside of DC or inside of DC. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you would like to get in on the conversation, you guys can give us a chat, tweet, or a call at 202-521-1320. We are joined by somebody who I always love to have a conversation with, Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly is a senior columnist and editor at the Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a conversation, basically, at the very least, starting it off, speaking upon Representative Lewis and also Vivian. Both of them end up dying on the same day, but Lewis is getting the most attention for this. I would like to start off, though, by giving shout out to Marco Rubio, who put out a tweet on how he honors his great, great friend, Lewis, with a picture of Elijah Cummings. It was an honor to know and be blessed with the opportunity to serve in Congress with John Lewis, a genuine and historic American hero. May the Lord grant him eternal peace. And yes, the man whose hand he's shaking is Elijah Cummings. There's going to be a lot of this, right? People basically trying to get some level of gravity off of the life of Lewis. And a lot of this is going to be false bravado, entirely for the political aim of just getting something off of it. How do you see this? Meaning from the standpoint of Lewis passing, and we're going to get to Vivian also. But how do you process this? I guess in the sense of the life that he's lived, in the context of the time that we're living in now. I guess you could say the missteps, the successes. You can go, I guess, anywhere you want to go with this, but how do you view it?
Well, I think it's funny because Elijah Cummings had already passed away last year. They did sort of resemble one another, but I was like the senator nor his staff had bothered to check, so he was shaking hands with somebody who had already died, the wrong person who had died a year ago. But John Lewis, you can't say too much about what he did as a young man. In the early 60s, in the days of SNCC, he was one of the first members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. People like that did risk their lives. We say that we should not say that without pointing out that is quite literally true. People did die in the struggle to end Jim Crow segregation in this country. So I give him and everyone who did that work in those days, I give them all kinds of credit. However, I don't think anybody gets a lifetime pass from critique. When he won elective office back in the 80s, he became a member of Congress. He defeated Julian Bond in a much talked about race. Julian Bond was expected to win, and John Lewis defeated him unexpectedly. But since that time, he was a run-of-the-mill, neoliberal, member of Congress. He did not stand out in any way. He did not have any sponsor any groundbreaking legislation. As with other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, he became more conservative as they were targeted by big money. And he was a person who was always used to bolster the argument for the right wing. He embarrassed himself. He actually had to backtrack in 2016 when the Congressional Black Caucus, as ordered, the Black Caucus Foundation endorsed Hillary Clinton. He claimed he disparaged Sanders' work in the movement himself as a young man. He claimed he didn't know who he was, but he knew who the Clintons were. At the time, he didn't know who the Clintons were at all. He had to backtrack and clarify his statements. But then he went on to dismiss Sanders' signature policy initiatives, and he said, well, you can't, college can't be free, and housing can't be free, and healthcare can't be free. In an ideal world, I think they all would be free, but that's the kind of thing he stood for, and someone who I'd like to frankly slap dubbed him the civil rights icon, and that was repeated over and over and over again. And Lewis was dragged out always to tell the rest of us what we could not have, but to, at the same time, always talk about the glories of this movement, which is supposed to mean more than just saying that someone was arrested or was beaten by the police in this or that year, or they marched with King. It's supposed to mean something now. So that's my take on Lewis. And also in 2017, when Trump was being inaugurated, he said he would not attend the inauguration because Trump was not a legitimate president. And he said because he believed that Russia interfered in the election. Now, he could have said he was illegitimate because he did not win the popular vote. He could have said that and made a case against the Electoral College, but he did not. He just fell back on the Democratic argument of the day, which really did not, and as it turned out, the whole Russian interference thing did not amount to anything.
I'm curious. From the time you've had to have seen him as he's gone through Congress and whatnot, what changed? Meaning, is it something where the person gets into a position of authority or gets into a position and his point of view is being tilted once he's in that position? Or was he always that person? Meaning, did he always have that particular point of view when he was in that particular part of the civil rights movement? Or was it changed as he got into the political machine?
It's hard to say, where he, and in my opinion, ended up falling short. Some people were in the movement. They were self-interested. They wanted to have opportunities for themselves, opportunities they did not have as long as segregation was legal. And so they were happy to get their own foot in the door and say, well, that's what we fought for. We have the right to vote. Discrimination is illegal. That's it. I'm good. And it's hard to say where he fell on this spectrum. So there were people who were somewhat conservative anyway. There were other people, of course, who wanted more revolutionary change and wanted to continue to press the system, and were not happy with and after those victories, we entered a period of, and it's still ongoing, a period of reaction against those victories. So it's hard to say where he fell, but I think it's incumbent upon us not to just proclaim that someone has a lifetime path and no one can, that nobody needs to be called an icon. We can judge people based on what they have done or not done. And we should see ourselves as people who are able to freely talk about what it is that we observe. So I think that's the most important thing, too.
So I wanted to give some reflections on C.T. Vivian. C.T. Vivian died on the exact same day. Could you give us an idea on who he was in the context of his life and even up to the point where he passed also?
Yes, he was a minister like many of those who were close to Dr. King. John Lewis actually started out studying for the ministry and met C.T. Vivian and others at the Highlander School in the 1950s. Vivian was, I had to look him up a little and find out about him. He was born in Missouri, but he spent a lot of his childhood in the North, in Illinois. But he became a minister. He became dedicated to the movement. He, as I just said, he met Lewis at the Highlander School, and he was involved in a lot of the campaigns that have become connected with King, with the March to Selma, and so forth. But I think by not going into politics, we don't hear as much about people like him, because when the movement ended, he went on to do other things with his life. But I'm told by someone who knew him, he was a person who had an international perspective, perhaps more of a left-wing perspective about the civil rights movement. He did not see it solely as a means of getting the vote and ending discrimination, although those were very important things. He had a more expansive view of what the movement should have been about. So he's one of the people who gets less attention, although he was throughout those years and the rest of his life, he never stopped struggling just for human rights. I'll put it that way. So that when that struggle was done, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, that he saw a need for larger, like King, greater changes in the United States. So, and he, lived a long life. As you point out, he lived to be 90. He ended up being honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Obama. And he, although that Presidential Medal of Freedom, I don't know how that got started. You always see pictures of people getting this medal around their necks like Olympic athletes. I'm not sure how that ever came to be, but one cannot argue with what he did. And he also was one who risked a great deal in his lifetime doing the work that we now, that we can sometimes forget how radical they were considered at the time. But as I said, yesterday's radical can become, in some cases, as with Lewis, yesterday's radical can become today's milquetoast and can become today's representative of the status quo. I don't think that was true of Vivian, but it was definitely true of John Lewis.
We are going to take a break. You're listening to Margaret Kimberly. She is the senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. For those who are listening, you hopefully know you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're also joined for this segment and the last segment by Margaret Kimberly. She is a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, thanks for being with us. I want to follow up here. I wasn't around for the last segment. I was kind of holding my breath, waiting to ask you something, but it would be a bit of a change of topic, and so I'll do it now at the top of this new segment. I'm just curious. We have a bunch of guests who we've had on for a long time, well predating our tenure on the show. And so I'm thinking of starting to ask a little bit more about the guests so I can get to know them a bit better. But just to get a sense, how'd you get involved? And we can tie this back into the conversation we were just having. Specifically, I want to get a sense for the sort of change in perspective in the civil rights movement and over the last 60 years since then. What needs didn't get met at the time? When did people start to realize that wasn't getting met? And that there were these larger conversations outside of just, purely legal equality or some of this sort of selective economic policies that got put in place back in the 60s and following that through affirmative action and other stuff. I wanted to get into that, but I also wanted to start with this. Where are you coming from? How'd you get involved in politics? I saw 2006 was when you started contributing for Black Agenda Report. Were you one of the founders of that? Can you just sort of lay out a bit of your history?
Co-founder of Black Agenda Report with Glenn Ford and the late Bruce Dixon. We had started out, there was with another website, which still exists, called Black Commentator. And for a variety of reasons, we decided to do our own site, Black Agenda Report. So we started around Election Day in 2006, around the time that the Democrats took control of Congress. And that was, I remember that everyone was jubilant about that. And I remember Glenn Ford wrote a piece called Let the Congressional Black Caucus Be Black. And it was about how Nancy Pelosi played her role as the conservative to beat down the progressives. And these long-standing Congressional Black Caucus members had to keep in line and weren't allowed to do the things that as former progressives they wanted. So that tells you the story of Black Agenda Report. And our political viewpoint, we say that we provide news and analysis from a Black left perspective, and the emphasis on left, not Democratic Party perspective. Most of my life I had been a Democrat, a liberal, but as I exposed myself to people like Glenn and Bruce and others, I have moved further and further left. As a result of writing every week all these years, I was able to write my book, Presidential: Black America and the Presidents, and on a variety of issues. And we at Black Agenda Report, we tackle domestic and international news. We have a book forum, a book review. Like most people who are activists, the writers, I have a day job. I have to always point that out and be honest. There aren't many people who can make a living solely by writing and doing the things that I've talked about. So I've been very lucky to have had the opportunity to expose myself to political viewpoints that are hidden, frankly. That's what I'm writing about this week, how the corporate media doesn't tell us, for example, that Trump gave an interview to Telemundo last week, and he said something's going to happen in Venezuela, which should be a news story. Is he threatening war? What does that mean? But we haven't heard anything about that. So that's why we need independent media. I'm very glad to have continued my relationship with Black Agenda Report. That's why we need Radio Sputnik and all the programs that are available there. Because if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post and listen to NPR and watch CNN, you still don't know what's going on in the world. The independent media plays a really vital role in keeping us informed. So does that help? You also asked me about the movement itself. Well, the movement suffered a severe blow when King was assassinated. Toward the end of his life, he talked more about peace. He famously opposed, a year to the day before he died, opposed the Vietnam War. He began to talk about economic issues, about economic inequality in the country. And the country moved further to the right, partly as a result of, frankly, of his activities and others. It was as if black people had enough and shouldn't ask for anything more. And Richard Nixon is the one who was elected president in 1968, the year that King was killed. And we've had either Republicans in office or Democrats who make the case for running because they are conservative. And we have a country now that is a failed state in large part because of this further and further rightward shift, which has impacted all of us, but black people especially. I read once when King was alive, there were only 600,000 people incarcerated in the country. And now there are 2.2 million. It's nearly quadrupled. So that, I think, is an example of how the country has frankly gone backwards after those legal victories. So I hope that that helped answer. It was kind of an open question. I hope that made sense, and that was what you were looking for.
Thank you. Totally. No, it was an open question, like an open-faced sandwich, and you put the other side of that sandwich on mine. So it was matched. It was perfect. Thank you. One sort of quick actual follow-up there. You're talking about how obviously MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. was, as far as I can tell, the leader. He at least is retrospectively seen as the leader of the civil rights movement during the 60s until he was killed. Until he was assassinated, until he was taken out. Looking at the current Black Lives Matter movement, there are a few early founders: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors. Then there have been people who sort of taken on different mantles at key points, but I can't find a single person who's leading this thing. Do you see that as an asset? Do you see that as a detriment? How do you think that that's shaped the way that the modern Black Lives Matter movement, the sort of modern civil rights movement in the black community, as far as I can tell, how that's shaped how that's gone in the past couple of years?
Well, I think the idea of leaderless movements is not, I don't think it works out very well. I think that was one of the ways they got rid of Occupy. The organization Movement for Black Lives, the founders are now establishment Democrats, especially Alicia Garza. She was in the news earlier this year. She engineered this phony endorsement of Elizabeth Warren by the Working Families Party. It was very clear the leadership endorsed Elizabeth Warren, but the members of the organizations once again preferred Bernie Sanders, but it blew up in her face and people knew it was phony. So that's where the kind of leadership she is providing. She dispenses patronage. All these foundations give her money. She decides who gets it. She plays a role in Democratic Party politics. She was among those who sponsored a survey of black political opinion, which had no questions, none whatsoever, about foreign policy, which was interesting. And I guess her thought was that's not something we need to worry our pretty little heads about. So that's what leadership consists of now. People who are prominent for a variety of reasons, but who unfortunately, inevitably become part of the non-profit industrial complex and patrons of the Democratic Party and Democratic Party donor class. So that's unfortunate, but it doesn't have to stay that way either. But I think that we're going to see a lot of changes in the near future. The country has been driven by the coronavirus pandemic first, which created many changes and many anxieties, which I think led to George Floyd's killing, sparking a new movement. That movement's not going anywhere. People are going to run out of their unemployment checks in a couple of weeks, I think in 1 week, and Congress hasn't yet acted on it. So we have a fractured society. There is a place for leadership to step in, and who that will be, I don't really know. Since King's time, we've had people who were heads of organizations who appear to be leaders, or Jesse Jackson with his presidential runs. But and Obama, unfortunately, was seen as a leader, but he was very conservative, in my opinion. And as he often said, he was not the the president just of Black America, but he didn't even take into account the things that we needed. So he got, I believe, unwarranted support and admiration and respect. So that's where we are now. But we're living at a pivotal moment. Nobody knows what's going to happen with the presidential election or with other things in the world. But I would just say buckle up. It's going to be an interesting year.
I think you're right. I mean, one quick question here, one quick follow-up. The first segment, you guys were talking about leaders during the 60s, many still living. Sadly, John Lewis just passed recently, but the sort of legacy that we're still living within, that we're still using as our frame of reference. And we were just talking about modern leaders, and you're saying that they kind of fell short. You can't give an identity because that would be putting the cart before the horse. You can't choose the person who you would have be the leader. But what qualities would you look for in terms of any advice you could give to people with an ability to sort of put a person into a position at their head? What qualities would you look for in that person in our current moment?
Well, the person would have to be independent of party politics, independent of the Democratic Party, independent of the Democrat donor class, a person who spoke to the needs of working people, who spoke to the needs of that we have now as a result of this 50-year-long move to the right, who spoke about foreign policy and did not separate the U.S. from the rest of the world, and who was always working for just solutions for ordinary people and spoke to their needs. You know, we have a country now where people are struggling terribly, and nobody talks about it. Half the country, this is before COVID, before that damage to the economy, half the people with low-wage work, millions of people with no health insurance. And this was something that no one spoke to. So we would have to have a leader who spoke to those things, no one talking about mass incarceration and the need to end that system. So that's what that's what I would hope that someone would speak to, and talking about ways that really radically change the country. We can't have nibbling around the edges. No more of that, because you end up with nothing. You end up with a minimum wage that hasn't gone up for years. You end up with working people who are struggling. You end up with police killing 1,000 people every year, and it doesn't make the papers. You end up with the United States waging wars of aggression around the world, and it becoming a bipartisan project. So those are the things I would want to see. Someone dedicated to human rights and seeing that the United States is in desperate need of improvement in the human rights of its citizens.
I agree with you. Margaret, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah, hopefully we can have you back on soon. Also, thank you for the life history, at least a very small subset of your life's history. Really appreciate you going back over that with us. That was the voice of Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly is an author. She's also a senior columnist and an editor for a Black Agenda Report. But again, she's an author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. Hopefully we'll have her back on soon. We have another great hour coming up at 9:30. We're talking with Tom Luongo. Just in a couple minutes here, we're going back over headlines and we're taking calls at 9:15 Eastern. Be back in a minute. Another great hour coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour of our show, the show that brings you more sides of the issues that matter in the politically independent corner. I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan. I am Jamarl Thomas.
Together, Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Together, we are Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. How many more times can I say our names before I drive people crazy? I'm not going to try. That was enough. All right, with that stuff out of the way, let's get back into the top headlines this morning. Our first headline, we were just talking about this with Margaret Kimberly. 80-year-old Georgia representative and civil rights icon John Lewis has died as a result of cancer. Rep. Lewis is a prominent member of the civil rights movement at a very early age, acting as one of the Big Six activists influential in organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. At the time of his passing, Lewis had been a representative for Georgia's 6th district since 1987. Talked about this, you know what, maybe we'll come back to this after headlines. Talk about this a little bit more later. Controversy has arisen over a proposed housing and urban development rule that would permit federally funded homeless shelters to use a person's physical characteristics, such as height and facial hair, to determine whether they quote-unquote belong in a women's or men's shelter. This comes according to a copy of the rule's text obtained by Vox, published by Vox. We're also talking about this at 8:15 earlier with Jamarl and I. In the latest Washington Post ABC poll, Biden extended his lead over Trump with 55% to 40% of registered voters choosing Biden. In May, Biden led by 10 points. In March, that lead was only 2. Trump has seen a 28-point drop in the public approval rating of his handling of COVID-19 since March, with weakening showing up in even the public's appraisal of Trump's handling of the economy. For reference, at the same time in 2016, Clinton led 47 to 43. In our next headline, this is a brief COVID roundup from around the states. Florida has been reporting over 10,000 new cases a day for the 5th day in a row. In Texas, Nueces County, where Corpus Christi is located, 85 infants have contracted the coronavirus. That's again, they've contracted the coronavirus, not necessarily suffering from the symptoms of COVID-19, but those are confirmed cases. Bahamas has banned flights from the U.S. and closed its beaches after seeing its cases almost triple since the beginning of the month, since July 1st. Those cases rose from 104 total confirmed coronavirus cases to 153. In our next story, union employees are planning protests across the U.S. today in support of Black Lives Matter, as well as higher minimum wages and expanded benefits. Organizers from unions, including the SEIU, that's the Service Employers International Union, say employees plan to walk off the job for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That is a tribute to George Floyd, who was killed after a police officer kneeled on his neck for approximately 8 minutes and 46 seconds. There's a brief sort of caveat there, like a brief asterisk, where that number was technically like a minute too long or something. They later retracted it and walked it down to 7 minutes and 46 seconds. But that would be a nitpick if I made any more of a point of that than I just did. In our next headline, in Portland, the police union president said he wants protests to stop and conversations to start. This follows a protest Saturday night that was later declared a riot when protesters barricaded the police union building and lit it on fire. Less than an hour later, police had cleared the area and put out those fires. The city has been the center of the use of unmarked vans by camouflaged federal officials who have reportedly been detaining protesters without probable cause. This is a move that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi likened to the actions of a banana republic. Two House Democrats, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, have also called for a probe into what they called these, quote, secret police forces, end quote. And the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Marshals Service over their deployment of agents in the state, that is Oregon. In our next headline, quarterbacks for the Saints and the Seahawks have been some of the most prominent players criticizing the NFL's attempts to deal with the coronavirus while starting its season. Issues that they're protesting include how regularly pro players will be tested, the number of preseason games taking place, and the length of the acclimation period for avoiding injuries, as well as what protections there should be for players who want to opt out, either out of injuries or out of fear of the coronavirus. In our next headline, China is pushing back as the UK today is set to suspend its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. As part of an announcement by UK's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab.
This is also part of a sort of weeks-long, maybe months-long, arguably years or decades-long, but let's just focus on the sort of local time frame. It's part of a longer process of a back and forth between China and the West, specifically the United Kingdom and the United States, over the territory of Hong Kong. Sort of territory, country, it's really hard to tell at this point based on what people are pushing for. In any event, this is the latest move. Came after a couple of weeks ago, Beijing passed a controversial new security law that sort of limited protesters' ability to dissent and try to push for Hong Kongese independence. And things have been heating up in the past week. We'll have more on this tomorrow, I'm sure. And in officially our last story, I'm going to be playing a clip from Viktor Orban in just a minute here. The Dutch Prime Minister says that the EU summit talks over a $750 billion deal are making progress, but could still fail. That is not a good sign. If he's saying they're making progress, it's only so that he can sort of balance the fact that he's about to say that they could still fail. The deliberations have been contentious, with Hungary's Viktor Orban the center of one main dispute, as the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte made it a provision that the countries taking grant money in the EU should agree to be bound by the rule of law. Orban said the EU should instead pursue the rule of law procedure against Hungary that began in 2018 while focusing on solving problems with COVID-19. Now, let's go to this clip. This is Viktor Orban talking about Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte.
I don't like blame game, but the Dutch man is the real responsible man for whole mess we have. I don't know what is the personal reason for the Dutch Prime Minister to hate me or Hungary, but he is attacking so harshly and making very clear that because Hungary, in his opinion, does not respect the rule of law, must be punished financially. That's his position, which is not acceptable because there is no decision about what is the rule of law situation in Hungary.
Yeah, the highlight there might just be him saying the phrase "Dutch man," the Dutch man. I can't imitate that accent, but anyway, I mean, it seems like what this. You know what? Let's close out headlines and we can comment on this after. You've been listening to the top news, top headlines with Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, with that out of the way, thank you, Andre. With that out of the way, I want to get back into the story for a second. It seems like what's going on here, and we're planning on having somebody on soon to talk about this, help to flesh out the details. It seems like what's going on here is obviously Hungary, specifically Viktor Orban in Hungary, has been doing more authoritarian stuff recently over the past couple of years. The EU has been trying to push him to stop doing whatever it is they don't like, not even giving a value judgment here. And then there's an older proceeding. He's referencing a rule of law procedure against Hungary in 2018. There's an older procedure, and it seems like this move in the EU summit is basically an attempt to sort of make those changes with the guarantee of money on the other side. It's trying to sort of push it through, and that's not going over well. Does that pan out? Does that make sense to you, Jamarl?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, not to mention sovereignty, right? I mean, so you get into this notion of countries being picky about being told what to do. And if they win the election, the people who win the election are going to feel, just based on the notion that we got more people than other people, then I should be in charge and I should be able to lead. Well, the moment that you have something like a superstructure over top of your sovereign country, well, you're not sovereign anymore, especially if you don't entirely control your own money. And so they are, like you say, trying to sweeten the deal with cash. And he is balking at being told what to do. That's what it sounds like. It just like the United States doesn't entirely get that. It's one thing if you had a king or a queen or something else that was like kind of sitting over top of you. That's not what they, it's like, that's not what we have. So that doesn't entirely make sense to us. Like when the argument was coming up over in the UK, where they were like, is the Queen going to get involved? Is the Queen going to get involved? It's like, what do you mean is the Queen going to get involved? Who is the Queen to get involved in any of these political affairs? And yet there she is. And endowed by God. How profound is that? So it's like the European Union had this superstructure over regards to the laws and everything else that take place in their country. And the EU is unhappy with what has been taking place there, and he is unhappy that they are unhappy.
Yeah, that seems pretty on that level. I want to figure out what specifically they're pushing back on. So I mean, asking somebody to follow the rule of law does sound like something that people should be asked to do, especially, again, you're talking about sovereignty. If you have this idea of this nation state being a part of this larger entity that's, doing its human rights thing and its monetary policies and its fudged loan guarantees or whatever the case may be. That last part didn't necessarily make sense. If you have that like reduction of local sovereignty, you get into the territory where, of course, they're going to need to follow the rule of law. And if they're not following whatever the rule of law is, and if the rule of law is right, then it's good that it's good that people are coming down on them. They should be following that rule. But
well,
usually,
okay, wait. This gets into sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
Like, if a country is doing something heinous, should the country be allowed to do something heinous?
By whom?
Right. That's what I mean. That's why I find these questions fascinating. Like, who gets involved? When is it necessary for somebody to get involved? If there is a genocide being committed, should other countries get involved in order to stop the genocide? Is there like a moral and ethical authority associated with doing so?
Well, there are maybe two answers to this question, other than yes or no or something like that. Yes, but, and this is where it gets a little bit weird. Yes, but maybe the moral here's the idea. If there is a sort of overarching moral code that countries around the world have agreed to follow, and then one of them sort of breaks that pact, and every other country falls in line to condemn them, to sanction them, to invade them, whatever degree of force you want to use, then that's its own kind of sovereignty. Then there's this other kind of sort of limited sovereignty thing, or this other infringement on sovereignty, which is the United States has an ethical code that it sort of ostensibly follows, and then it uses that ethical code to crack down on countries that it doesn't like. Whether it itself follows that ethical code is another question. Whether its allies follow those ethics, that's another question. Exactly. But it seems like that second one is what's happened here. But then
that's so true.
This ties into the ideology thing.
Yeah, that's so true.
I'm closing up here, but yeah, that's the thing. Yeah,
I think the thing is, like, right, that's so true. It's hard to those questions aren't easy because you get into politics, where it's like, what's true of this, and are there incentives that are built into this process that may drive these behaviors in ways that are not necessarily indicative of reality? And I do think that's the second part. I don't know how. I think I agree with you on this. So I think I agree with you up to a point on this. I think we always end up agreeing up to a point. I'm going to let you take it because I want you to be able to take this wherever you want to go in regards to the segment for any of these stories that have gained your interest. Now, let me say this, though, one point. Look, they signed up to the European Union. And in signing up to that policy, they knew what they were getting, knew what they were getting into. At the very least, they weren't necessarily suckered into that structure. Orban is pushing back on that. I mean, but think about what the European Union did to Greece, right? They reduced Greece to their knees. I mean, using their finances to do so. Orban, he's not liked in particular. And the question becomes, what are you going to do in order to try to compel him to bend him to form? And he's being resistant to being bent to form. If that country is deeming something so, it is a hard charge for the European Union to tell them to change. Nevertheless, they all signed up to this policy. So it's like, it's one of those things where they have to work that out. I don't think any of them are going to war. So at the very least, or the very worst it could get, is some kind of sanctions.
Yeah, this ties. We're going to go into a break in just a minute here, but I'll just put this out there. It would be lovely to get somebody to go over, not meticulously necessary, but to give us a good, broad, factual overview of the history of the European Union from before its founding, with the foundation of NATO, post sort of World War II economic era, some early ideas about what the European Union might look like before it had that name, those perspectives, because that whole conversation is super relevant, super interesting. I mean, again, it's also... the European Union, the EU, sort of fits broadly into this sort of liberal democratic world order thing that the United States seems to have been presiding over. And we've had a few conversations just in this show this morning. We're talking about the different erosions in that facade, in the facade of whether we're actually doing the liberal democracy thing or whether the liberal democratic nations have incorporated a lot of aspects of fascism and communism, whichever other isms you want to incorporate, that they did to do their thing, to make more money, to assert more power over corporations, to have power asserted through them by corporations over people in order to make more money and to balance their budget sheets. There are all these different ways in which, as far as I can tell, these countries have sort of violated the standing. And so looking at the EU as this unique configuration of states built around this ideological framework, but with that, it's just this indictment of that. And it's just this interesting conversation that I want to get into. Maybe there are sides of it that I'm missing, hopefully, because then we get to learn more. In any event, we're going to go into a break right now. We'll be taking calls on the other side of this break, 202-521-1320. is the number to call. I see Louise from Virginia. We'll be with you in just a second, Louise. But if you're calling, if anybody else is calling, 202-521-1320 is the number you want to call. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick note here. If you want to catch us on the airwaves and you're in D.C., you can. We're on 105.5 FM, 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City or the wider Kansas City area, you can also listen to us there on the radio. We're on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also 1140 AM. If conversely, you want to listen to us online, you can. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're also over on Spotify, on YouTube. Do a quick search on YouTube for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas, and you'll find us. You'll also find us over on Twitter on Periscope, where we have a live audio feed going. That's twitter.com/faultlinesradio. And we're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number you want to call if you want to call in. Let's go to Louise. Louise from Virginia, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes. Good morning, everyone, boys and girls. I have to apologize first for being an oddity because I only have the radio. Now, and keep that in mind, please, because I have two small favors to ask of you. Please, please, please. Margaret Kimberly and Tom Luongo are the best of the best and worth hanging on their every word. I happened to miss, I had an emergency and I missed Margaret Kimberly telling us about her background. I wonder if you could give that again very briefly, because I venerate her. And I also venerate Tom Luongo, but I also, please, could you kindly ask him for us lesser intellects, which is me, not you and Jamarl, just please slow down a little bit. So that's two requests, Margaret Kimberly's background, and please, please slow down Tom Luongo for us slower people. Thank you very much. Bye.
Louise, thank you. Bye. Yeah, I don't mean to shy you away or to push you away or anything like that. You've given us very good advice. I will bring this up with Tom Luongo. I'll take the hit for that. I'll tell him that we had a caller who likes him quite a bit and who just 10 minutes before he came on asked if he could please slow down a touch. With Margaret Kimberly's background, she didn't go too deep. What she focused on was sort of her background generally. She was a Democrat. She was on the left, and then she went more left-leaning. Specifically, what she was talking about was back in 2006 when the Black Agenda Report was founded. She came in, and that changed her perspective. That shifted her further to the left. She saw at the time she was talking about the sort of origin story of Black Agenda Report, where Glenn Ford, one of the co-founders, had been watching as the Democrats won the House. Won the Senate back in 2006. And Glenn Ford wrote a post about why the Congressional Black Caucus isn't more black. And those were sort of a few of the highlights of her history. But yeah, she was broadly describing where she came from. I asked it as a sort of vague and open-ended thing, and so she gave a very good response for the question I asked. Maybe we can go a bit deeper into this stuff too later, but that was a sort of brief take. But if you want to catch it, it was right at the beginning of the 8:45 segment, so our second to last segment now. In any event, any comment there, Jamarl?
No, that's perfect. Nailed it.
Totally.
I mean, that's exactly the way she went with it. So. No, I think that's fine.
Cool. Yeah. Anyway, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. You want to do the one about, you want to talk about the story for a second? One of the ones that you added to the document.
Healthy
about
Human Services?
Exactly, the HUD ruling.
Okay, so I feel like, man, that story is so weird. So it's it always feels like the issues that aren't really issues are being made into issues that we end up having to talk about because of how they affect people.
It's an
So
issue, man.
basically, Health and Human Services is making a policy adjustment, and I'll just read it just so we have point of reference of what we're talking about. So, Health and Human Services, okay, housing. I'm sorry, Housing and Urban Development is a rule. There's a rule change that will permit federally funded homeless shelters to use a person's physical characteristics such as height or facial hair to determine whether or not they belong in a women's shelter. Now, this is aimed directly at trans. You have the indignity and the problem of being a homeless, and you go to a shelter, and there's a person there, and that person is looking at you saying, that guy has an Adam's apple, so no. That woman was at that shelter because that woman identifies herself as a woman and lives a life as a woman. And regardless of what that particular guard sees that person to be, it is somewhat problematic to basically send that person back on the street or send that person into another home where they can be abused, which is honestly what will take place in regards to some of the shelters that they're sending people into, meaning in a choice between potentially being abused in a shelter where they don't identify as their sexuality as opposed to staying out in the streets. They may end up staying in the streets. I have a problem with this. There's, oh man, so many levels. Like the first level is having somebody in and of itself walking the streets without somewhere to stay. I think your society should be evolved to the point of that not happening at all. You have the richest country on the planet. That shouldn't happen. On top of that, where your decision space gets so narrowed, where it's like, okay, now we're cramming people into these homes where they don't know any of these other people who are there. And all of them are susceptible to crime. All of them susceptible to not knowing the other individual to which they're standing by. All of this is so problematic on so many levels. And now we're going to add this extra level of indignity to it. What do you think, Shane? I find this to be unnecessary. Now, tell me why I'm wrong on this, if you believe I'm wrong on this at all. I don't know your opinion on this.
This isn't so much unnecessary. The whole thing is just a hornet's nest. And there's so many people, I'll just focus on the left. I'll just forget the right exists for a second. If you look at the left, there are hugely varied interpretations or applications of values, of the values that the left has on issues of gender and people of transgender, et cetera. Those issues are incredibly complicated. You focused on the housing situation and like the sort of homeless crisis and how we shouldn't have people wanting for shelter in any event. And I tend to agree. I tend to agree that that's like where we should aim, and we would be able to get there pretty quickly if we had a diligent enough leader base and a diligent enough way of going about this stuff. We could solve those problems. I think that in some sense that might be the right take from this specific story. But then there is the other take too. I mean, and this is the obvious thing. If you have, as we do, split use homeless facilities where it's either, you stay in, if you're a man, you stay in the men's homeless shelter. If you're a woman, you stay in the women's homeless shelter. There's a reason for that being. And there are a lot of people who would criticize that. And I've heard a lot of people actually criticize that. Maybe you would have sort of split adjunct facilities, but then a major conjoined area where everybody, depending on whatever your gender identity is, or depending on how you were born, however the case, this is also complicated. You could just sort of share the facility. But once we start, as we did at the beginning, once we start introducing these gender divisions, and then we sort of have to figure out how this stuff works after the fact, it gets really heckin' confusing. Part of what makes this very difficult to talk about is that I don't have a sort of decided opinion because it's not one of my issues. I can see what all these different sides are saying, and the arguments seem weirdly proportional to me because it's so deeply tied to your sense of self and to your identity. So I understand why people are getting aggravated over these things, but
people feel some way about it.
Yeah.
And I can understand where I'm coming from. I come from the housing angle because I look at this as, well, people need housing. And if we're going to confine ourselves to this weird decision space where, because we have these kind of very rigid ideological guidelines of identity that have been just kind of brought up over time. And now you have this secondary thing of, okay, well, this person identifies as something else than what you, looking at them, would identify them as. How do you deal with that? Well, that's a fault line issue, right? There's no, like, the right and the wrong of that just doesn't exist. I'm sorry. And I take a look at that and say, well, look, if that person is identifying as that, maybe that person should be treated as such. And then you get into this other issue of security, right? That even just kind of pops into it, because then it becomes, okay, there's some people who are standing there, let's say women, who may feel unsafe because this other woman is there who they think or who they identify as a guy. Okay, is that an issue of security? And is it one of those things, once again, where because this is not something that is considered a priority, that it's not necessarily allocated for? Like, there's so many issues like that's wrapped up into this. I mean, but my generic default on this becomes, if that person is identifying as a female, get the benefit of the doubt, or vice versa. If the person identifies as male, give them the benefit of the doubt. I think this is usually relayed to from the other way around.
I hear you. The giving the benefit of the doubt rule is usually the best thing when you can rely on common sense, but this is a bureaucracy.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
That part's true.
And you can't, maybe you can. I just don't see how you can apply that kind of informal non-rule to a bureaucracy and expect it to fly. What bureaucracies want is a set of rules they can apply so they don't have to think about things. So you can just admit people who, are supposed to be admitted and deny the rest. You brought up security. That's going to be where most people's minds go with this one. Again, as a 6'2" dude, not that tall, but I've had people give me weird looks sometimes just for being tall and being in their vicinity. As I can understand, like, yeah, if I've decided that I was a woman, I could understand why some woman might not want to have me around, especially if I had only recently transitioned. And if there was this feeling of like latent threat or potential violence, all this stuff, that's why you separated the shelters out on a gendered basis anyway. So I can understand that. The problem is, if I were to say that, as I just did, a lot of people would probably come after me and go like, well, are you saying that the transgendered women who are wanting to move into these shelters are going to be violent, or like there's some inherent propensity? And no, that's not at all what I'm saying. All I'm saying is I understand why people might feel that threat and why that might, contribute to this sort of rule being put into place. It's also messed up, though.
That's
What's
the
up?
catch. It's the issue of presence. If I am 5'10", or let's say if I'm 5'5", I may feel some kind of way if I think not so much that I am immediately going to this notion that this person is going to injure me, but by the same token, you don't know that person from anybody. That person is a random person that you could have met at McDonald's. Like, it's the problem of not knowing. Like, it's one thing if it's a family member, but this is not a family member. These are just random people that have the bad luck to be homeless. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
It is. And I mean, here's the other thing. Like, I have a decent number of transgender friends who, some of whom are politically active and like to engage with these issues. And there are like longstanding, systemic, decades-old problems in that space. As far as I can tell, pretty much uniquely among the different, subdivisions of demographics in American society or whatever. There's some serious, real problems in terms of like this potentially legal threats, weird, unseen sort of blank areas in the system where they're not supported, they're not given any provisions, they're maybe come down on more harshly than should be. As far as this whole cluster of issues.
Let's just be clear for the moment, though. This is done politically. This was only done for political reasons. It was just done for harshness. It wasn't a mandated. It wasn't a need. It wasn't any of that stuff. They took a political position in order to injure a vulnerable class because they are just ideologically against that class.
Well, but who are they injuring in this case? Transgendered people?
Yes. If you can get to a situation where you can say, I'm going to deny this person entry into this place, and that person is going to go into the street or go somewhere where they're going to be in fear of their life, then yes, you've injured that party.
I don't think that you say harsh. I don't think that it's but here's the thing is that again, we were just talking about security, and we're talking about the issues of the non-transgendered people who are already living in these facilities or staying in these facilities. Like, there are two sides. That's the other side of the moral calculus here. The security in this case would be for the non-transgendered residents of those communities. So it's like on the moral calculus or the moral scales or whatever, there's something on the other side too. I don't think this is just a political ruling. There might be some political bias behind it, but I don't see how this is just a sole attempt to sort of swat the transgendered rights or the rights of transgendered peoples.
Okay, we're gonna have to pick this one up in a different time.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
All right, but this is Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. We do have a call on the line, and we can get to the caller just for keep him for 30 seconds. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's not a call on the line. It's Tom. Great. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined for this and the next segment by Tom Luongo, frequent guest, longtime friend of the show, geopolitical analyst, and a publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. Tom, how are you doing this morning?
And how are you? Good morning, Jamarl.
Good. Your connection's a little bit choppy. I just heard that coming in. We might. Yeah.
Really? I'm sitting right. I'm on Wi-Fi. I'm sitting right next to my router.
There we go. Okay, that's perfect. That's actually perfect. I think it was just coming in. There was a little bit of overlap. And you know what? To be nitpicks. And asked, is it okay? She asked us if we could try to get you to slow down sometimes, basically. She said, you talk very quickly and you're smart. And so the things that you're saying sometimes will just fly over people's heads. At least that's how she felt. And so she wanted, this is a little bit weird. Would you be willing to slow down sometimes? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Or just dial in and say, dude, restate that. That's fine. I'm good with that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a weird thing. I will try to apply the same thing to myself and Jamarl. I have the cattle prod at hand in case we go too fast and we need to shriek and then slow down.
All good.
Good to hear. Yeah, and anyway, in any event, with that out of the way, we have a couple of topics we could get into today, recommended by producer Raheem, some of them schooling versus homeschooling versus unschooling. I have a deep tie here. We also have the topic, Brexit, the situation with the UK, the British monarchy, Ghislaine Maxwell. Yes. And how that ties into the United States.
Oh, we have to hit Brexit. But go wherever you want. But there. I'm throwing my net in for Brexit. I'm throwing my card in for Brexit. But go wherever you want to begin with.
Let's do that. Let's do the fun one. Yeah. Let's do that. Let's do the fun one that you're super interested in, Jamarl. Let's start with Brexit. Tom, what have you been doing with this? Yeah. What's your take been on this? How do you think that this applies to what's going on now? How do you see the sort of resonance from that? Where do you think this is important now?
Okay, so the Brexit story relative to Ghislaine Maxwell is complicated. So I'll have to keep it slow, and it may take up most of the segment to get it done. The way I see this is the following, and let's not mince words. We have a complete insurrection against President Trump at every level, media, political, economic, everything, right? I think that's a given at this point. And whether you agree with it or not is irrelevant. The Epstein story it strikes right at the heart of what we would consider massive corruption at every level in Western government. I'm talking the European governments, I'm talking the UK, I'm talking the United States. It doesn't really matter. Everybody, this thing is huge, and it has tentacles and tendrils into everything that goes back to stories your dad worked on, like Bill Browder and Khodorkovsky and Edmund Safra and the rape of Russia. It goes back to all of those things. The ability for these people to blackmail and an influence peddle through a prostitution ring in order to shape government policy over the last, say, 30 years or so is immense. And the potential for any of that information to make it out into the public is immense, right? So when I look at it from that perspective, and I look at what's happening in the general milieu of what's going on today. I see the following. I see the European Union trying to, this morning, making a major stride towards debt neutralization and fiscal integration, which is the Achilles heel of the European Union, right? The structure of the euro is its Achilles heel. And for further political integration to happen, fiscal integration amongst all the EU members has to happen. Well, that has to happen in order for the EU to become ascendant as the dominant power in the West, kind of setting...
Right, wait. Stop. Tom, just for one moment. Right there.
Sure.
Right there. That's going to be a case where somebody's going to say, Tom needs to repeat that. But I love that you said that. Because basically you're making the point that in order for the EU to even operate the way that they wanted it to ultimately operate, you need further political integration, meaning you need those countries to act less like countries and to be defined under this one umbrella where you can get this kind of fiscal aspect to it that wasn't there prior. Is that what you're saying with this, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. And actually, they already have a lot of the political integration through the European treaties and the tyrannical actions of the European Court of Justice and all that. What they need is a currency that they actually have control over, which they don't have. And the euro, the way it's designed, is designed very poorly. Imagine if the U.S. dollar, if Illinois could print dollars to bail out its pension fund, right? Its bankrupt pension fund. If we had that situation here in the United States, the U.S. dollar would not be the world's reserve currency, would not be the world's dominant trade currency. We don't have that. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department have ultimate control over all issuance of dollars. That is not the case in Europe, where Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Latvia, they all have the ability, maybe not Latvia, but all have the ability to issue debt and issue euros at different interest rates, at different risk, yada, yada, yada. That's a mess, and that needs to be cleaned up. Now, the goal is for the European Union to set the for lack of a better term, the political compass of the West, and understand that the European Union is not a democracy. It has a parliament, but that parliament has no power. All power in the European Union rests with the European Commission and the European Council, okay? And they're unelected, all right? They're an unelected Politburo, for lack of a better term. So in order for that to go forward, and this is, I firmly believe that it is the goal of the globalists that have been the architects behind the EU, what I like to call the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum, those who show up at Davos every year, and the Bilderberg Group and all those other guys. But just generally speaking, those people, right? Their goal has been to subsume the UK.
You still with us, Tom? Okay, Tom might be back in a moment.
Tom sadly dropped out. That was very interesting. This is stuff we were talking about the EU earlier.
Stuff is fascinating because basically you have what started off as this kind of economic union that basically evolved over time into this political body. And as it becomes a political body, well, you have to ask, why would they do that? Well, part of the reason is if you have a bunch of multiple countries that are small, the United States has, 320 odd million people with a massive economic dominant force. And you have other economic nations like China, they would get preyed upon. Each of those nation states, if it were just left as a nation state, would get preyed upon. Of course, you had stuff going back to the war where they didn't necessarily want to, they wanted to forge relationships that they could deal with that stuff where they wouldn't end up back up into another world war. But if you're looking at the world outside of yourself and you're seeing these major economies and you're looking at these small, tiny nations, what do you do? And is there some rationale that says, hey, maybe we need to cobble ourselves together into an economic force so we can deal with the other stuff? Yeah, you do it. Tom, welcome back. Oh, there you are. You're slightly lagging on us.
All right. So, where did you leave off?
Oh man.
Well, you left off talking about they were trying to subsume the UK. That the European Union was trying to subsume the UK.
Yeah. So,
oh man.
Yeah, Tom, your connection is rough. So
this is
let's
bad. Yeah, we should probably try. We'll try to cut this and then recall to get this.
I was going to say let's take an early break, And let's see if we can get Tom back on the line in between the time. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment. We're going to try to do some background work.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick sort of programming note out there. If you're listening to us and you want to hear us in some other way, I'll give you all the ways you can hear us. You can catch us in D.C. on the air, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. You can also catch us all over the place online. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. Those are all audio. We're also on video over on YouTube. Do a search for Jamarl Thomas or Fault Lines Radio. You'll find two independent channels, each live streaming right now. Also on Twitter, you'll find the Periscope feed. Just go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio, and you'll see right up top there, every morning we have a 3-hour full live audio feed going. With that out of the way, we have Tom Luongo back on the air. I hear he sounds better than when we last talked. The connection got messed up in some way. Tom, you're with us again. How's it going?
I hope this is better.
Much
better.
It is. Much better.
Much better.
Success.
All right, well, I guess sitting right next to my router is not good, but going out on my porch is fine. What can I tell you? So, boomer tech, I guess. I don't know. I have no idea. So, all right. Really sorry about that, but let's get back to it. So, what I was trying to say earlier is that what's going on with the European Union is that the big picture to remember is that the EU wants to be the dominant power in the West. All right, it's being built as an unelected technocracy with oligarchic control, unelected oligarchic control. That's what it's being built to do. And remember, the UK was brought into the EU under very dubious circumstances, where Margaret Thatcher was betrayed by her cabinet, and then they were brought in that way. And so Brexit threw a massive wrench in that, as well as the election of Donald Trump. And now, for 4 years, we've been dealing, up until last year, we were dealing with a UK government that was complicit in trying to betray Brexit up until Theresa May was removed from power. Boris Johnson ascended, and I feel very strongly that Donald Trump, and the Queen are all working very strongly to thwart the EU, realign the United States and the United Kingdom and rebuild those bonds. And that is what's driving the current political climate. So what's driving, I think, a lot of what's happening here in the United States, why the massive push to get rid of Donald Trump is here, right? To the point of, we have politicians here in America committing literal harikiri, like Bill de Blasio in New York is literally killing his political career in New York City by inviting the kind of chaos that he is. But that's
Tom,
my
is it
opinion.
possible?
So, yeah.
Is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that Donald Trump is failing miserably all on its own, and that it's not necessarily...
It is
go ahead.
small, but I think it's possible, certainly. And his reelection is not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. But I do believe that when I look at this stuff, and when I see the kind of full court press that I'm seeing right now, and certainly this is July, and honestly, presidential election campaigns don't get interesting until late September. And and the same thing with House races, the same thing with Senate races. Most people don't really care at this point. National polls are always useless. So let's just put all that stuff aside. They're designed to construct narratives and for nothing else. and they always have been. So now, the best historical precedent for, I think, this campaign right now is probably Dewey Truman in the 1940s, and I think that's where I think that's going to be the best model for this. But regardless, I don't want to go too far off-field because we want to get back to Ghislaine Maxwell.
You're fine.
So
No, you're fine. Yeah, go for it.
How does Brexit? Yeah. With Ghislaine Maxwell and everything I said about her and Epstein and the ability to blackmail and to create governments acting against their people's best interest because you've got senators and judges and compromise because they know that they're controllable. Okay. And that is a reality of our political life. And so the big picture here is very simple when you take to the 40,000-foot level. And Soros has made this abundantly clear, as have other people of his ilk. The destruction of the United States as a political power is his goal. The statement of his mouthpieces now and the leaders of Black Lives Matter are saying the same thing. It's above board. It's open. It's what it is now. And so look at that in the bigger geopolitical picture, okay? The EU needs fiscal integration in order to undergird their political integration. They cannot have the UK get away from them because then that creates a bulwark against them. They cannot have the United States survive and improve internally as a political unit. They need it atomized and split. Okay, so it all makes sense that all of this would be being pressured now. Now, how does that fit in with Ghislaine Maxwell? Well, it's a good question, and my dominant theory, and I'm not saying that it's a good one, and I'm not saying that it's that it's the only theory out there. But my theory is that this whole Epstein thing is being driven by Trump and Barr to as a counterattack against what's happening, and by placing Maxwell, trying to go after Epstein and get him out into custody, that creates the opportunity to expose everything he knows. Same thing with Maxwell now that she's under custody. Okay, and the Southern District of New York is where all these lawsuits and these indictments have been filed because the Southern District of New York exists as a almost separate political entity within the United States government to protect the very powerful, meaning Wall Street and the banks and everybody else and international intelligence services and the rest. That's where cases against the powerful people go to die or be settled out of court before discovery ever happens. And so it makes perfect sense to me that all of this is happening. It stays in the Southern District of New York. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still amazed that Ghislaine Maxwell is still alive. And I'm surprised that everybody's talking about it in those terms. But at this point, after what happened with Epstein, it's kind of hard for even normal people to look at the situation and go, this is weird. We have the thing this morning with one of the judges who was assigned the case against that involving Deutsche Bank and Epstein, just had a hit put on her, killed her son, and her husband's in critical condition. We're at a point where things are breaking down very, very quickly, and a lot of very powerful people are beginning to panic. And I don't know whether I'm right or I'm wrong, but it's pretty clear that there's a big story here, and you can construct whatever theory you'd like around it, and you'll probably be right. But my spidey sense is telling me that this is Trump and Barr pushing the ball against people like. Against not only the European Union, but also the insurrectionists in his own government. I personally think that a lot of this is being driven by the DNC. It's being driven by the former officials in the Obama administration, all of whom hands are dirty. And I don't know if there's a Russiagate angle to this or not, but there may be. I mean, there's so much to talk about here from that perspective. And there's so much we don't know that, all of our speculation, no matter how well informed, it's still just speculation. How's that?
Tom, I appreciate that you would say that it's speculation. I appreciate that. Is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that these things happen singularly and separate? Meaning that it's not necessarily, I got to be honest with you, I would be more comfortable if I thought that there was some grand man pulling strings. I am less comforted by the thought of bowling balls, just kind of everybody trying to make their own way and scratch for their own piece. Is it possible that that's what it is and not necessarily a grand, kind of a grand plan for this stuff?
Yeah. No, I agree. No, Jamarl, you're right. And in effect, I'm not even describing a grand plan. What I'm describing is what happens when the bowling balls starts going down the lane and things are getting knocked over. And then this gets to this, creates this, which creates this, which creates that. Or better yet, it's like pulling on a string and then having the whole, and then having the knot kind of fall apart, right? It's that kind of metaphor. And you're absolutely right that it's very possible that that's what's happening here. There's so many angles to this. There's so many people who are implicated by all of this. But the bigger picture is, even when you step back and go, okay, this is all happening as a consequence of a variety of other things happening, and now people are just scrambling around to try and, to protect themselves. Sure. But when you look at the overall effect of what's happening, it does slot in very nicely with the plan to have the EU replace the United States as the arbiter of policy for the West. And that's well known that that's their goal. So, and to what extent Maxwell fits into all of this, I think it is about how the question is who controls Ghislaine Maxwell and the information that she has. That's the question I still can't answer, okay? But I have to think at a certain level that given the amount of aggression on the one side, the amount of aggression that's been exhibited against Brexit, okay, against Trump's reelection, that this has to be a kind of counter strategy. Because it can't be part of that strategy. Otherwise, Trump would already be out of office. If Trump was guilty of, banging 15-year-olds on Pedo Island, he would already be out of office. It would have came out during the impeachment stuff. So the fact that he's still in power and has an AG that no one on the other side is happy with, that's a big deal. That's a big tell in my mind that there's a bigger game being played here. Okay.
So I want to come back to some of the stuff. Specifically, I want to come back to the Queen because I'm curious. I just haven't heard her put on the side of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, I think, ever, especially not as a trifecta. But where I want to go at this real quick is, why do you think the SDNY? Again, we're talking about theories here. You know more about this stuff than I do, and especially you're coming to it with theories that I haven't come at it with. And some of this stuff, obviously, I would push back on it, but we're having a cordial conversation. Why do you think the SDNY? What's the significance? Why do you think, particularly if the SDNY, like you said, is a place where cases against the powerful go to die? Why do you think that's where this is going? Why do you think if Trump and Barr are using this, why do you think they're using the SDNY? If it's just going to deflate any narrative?
They're not. They're not using the SDNY. They don't have any choice because the indictments were filed there originally.
Oh, pardon me.
The former U.S. Yeah, so it's not that Trump and they're not using the SDN. They're trying to get around it. Why do you think Barr tried to get rid of Jeffrey Berman? Why do you think Berman forced the extraordinary moment where he refused to resign, forcing the situation where Trump couldn't do a recess appointment so that he could so Trump and Barr could put in a U.S. attorney who they control. This is the second time Trump has gone after the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York in the past 4 years, and both times he was thwarted, okay, through procedure. Berman only got the job because a judicial panel recommended him, which was also a very weird thing, okay, because the Senate refused to nominate, not just nominate, but confirm anyone, because they didn't want Trump putting his guy in charge of the SDNY. This is the kind of prima facie evidence, in my mind, that tells you that this fight is sincere, it's real, and it's the one thing that still keeps me nominally on Trump's side, even though I think his foreign policy is a mess and yada, yada, yada. Like, that's a separate conversation. When we're talking about trying to clean up the swamp, this story is what draining the swamp is all about, okay? This is because, look, the Southern District of New York not prosecuting any of the bank's malfeasance in 2008 is the reason we have Occupy Wall Street today. Occupy Wall Street and now Antifa and BLM, because they're all downstream of that, okay? That kind of what Sam Francis used to call anarcho-tyranny is rampant across our judicial system. Rules for thee, but not for me. This is the situation. This is the way the elites think. I mean, even Hillary Clinton just made that argument recently about having to show up to testimony about her email servers against a judicial watch case. She literally said, "I'm too important to show up for this." I mean, this is the kind of thing that's driving both the left and the right completely crazy here in the U.S. Okay?
I do think it's driving the left and right completely crazy. I agree with you on that. That part, whether or not I agree with the Southern District Court of New York stuff, I definitely agree with you that not prosecuting Wall Street sent a horrible precedent in regards to how our public was viewing these guys. I mean, after all, you crash the economy and you walk. Like, that's amazing, right? And Obama, who's ran a hope of change, threw his bodies out there for him.
Seriously, go watch Go watch the movie about Martin Armstrong's incarceration called The Forecaster. Go listen to Martin Armstrong's story about how he dealt with the Southern District of New York. You'll learn more in an hour and a half about how corrupt that place is than anything I could give you here on the in 15 minutes on Fault Lines.
What's your take, Tom? Real quick. I didn't mean to cut you off there. You can come back to it. I mean,
no worries.
Come back to this after it. I had a quick question about Patrick Byrne and deep capture, just because it seemed like a natural segue from the conversation about Martin Armstrong. You can keep going with what you were saying. I was just curious about your opinion on that guy too.
I don't have an opinion on Patrick Byrne, to be honest with you. I just know that regulatory capture is real. It exists. That there's a revolving door between the Southern District of New York, the SEC, the CFTC, and Wall Street. That revolving door has been in effect for years. Everybody on Wall Street knows it. No serious analyst of Wall Street, alt finance or normie finance, disputes any of this. Okay, this has been going on. It's as deep a cesspit as you can possibly ask for, and this is why Chuck Schumer this is why he's so important to all of this, right? Because he's the senator for the for New York, and he covers, and he's the one that ensures who gets appointed U.S. attorney, because they have a say in this, right? The senators from the states have a say in who gets appointed to the U.S. attorney's office for their state, which is an interesting part of our separation of powers. So, the president doesn't have full autonomy at that level. Okay, fair enough, and maybe he shouldn't. That's a different argument for a different day. But the way the Queen slots into this is, remember when Trump went to go visit the Queen last summer while the switchover was happening between Theresa May and Boris Johnson? Do you remember how strident the opposition to Donald Trump meeting with the Queen of England was? They were trying to deny the President of the United States, another head of state, from coming, an ally of the UK, from coming in and meeting with the Queen. This is unprecedented. Okay? Understand that the whole idea here is that he's illegitimate on its face because he's Donald Trump and he's not actually president. No, they were absolutely dead scared of Trump sitting down and meeting with Queen Elizabeth and working and hatching out a plan to help implement Brexit. And I firmly believe that, because the minute Trump sat down with the Queen, Johnson ascends to become prime minister, and Johnson then just starts negotiating like a sovereign nation, and the EU has to back down on everything. And go look at the way the trade talks are working out. There's not going to be an extension in the fall, even though Sir Mark Sedwill, who's the former chief cabinet secretary and
this is very interesting. Tom, I'm sad that we have to cut this off here, but we've been speaking with Tom Luongo. Tom, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you guys for the opportunity. Take care and have a great week.
Hey, you too. Have a great week, Tom. Tom is a geopolitical analyst and the publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. You can check him out on Twitter at TFL1728. Those are the letters TFL. The number's 1728. You can also read his articles, tomluongo.me. We'll be back tomorrow. Another great show. First great show of the week this morning. Happy to host it with Jamarl Thomas. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
All right, this is the after show. Let's see. We have one, Wesley Walker. This is fantastic coverage. Great job. Well, thank you, Wesley Walker Jr. I appreciate it. All right, I am going to end this because we are planning on doing shows this evening, and so I will see you guys then.